Chapter 331 Siege of the Crimson Spire, 17. The dark sea was gone, and all the horrors that dwelt in its cursed depths were gone with it, too. The world was bathed in pure sunlight. The surface of the labyrinth suddenly became vibrant and bright, with stark shadows hiding under the jagged pillars of the crimson coral. The furious white sun burned above the crimson spire as if frozen in the middle of the sky. Sunny even had to cover his eyes for a few seconds. Laying on the ground, he allowed himself a few moments of rest. A short laugh escaped from his lips. I actually did it. Speak about the unlikely events. Unfortunately, he couldn't really rest yet. The battle wasn't over. The horde of nightmare creatures was not defeated yet. And somewhere in the spire, the Crimson Terror itself was not defeated, either. With a deep sigh, Sunny collected himself and rose to his feet. They were almost there. They almost escaped. Now, all that was left was to make one final push. Even if it was going to be the hardest one yet, looking at the tall mound of coral towering above him, he squinted against the light and began climbing it. Was it always so bright? As Sunny climbed, he summoned the runes and glanced at them. Shadows. Marble Saint. Thank gods. He knew that Saint was all right, but still wanted to check. The taciturn demon had been heavily damaged and was bound to spend a long time restoring herself. However, her existence was not in danger. Then his eyes slid lower. Shadow fragments. 999/1000. Crap. Sunny gritted his teeth. He was simultaneously excited and scared to find out what was going to happen once he saturated the shadow core. It was bound to be beneficial. But at what cost? Would he go into a slumber for several weeks, as Saint had? Or suddenly become incapacitated amidst furious combat, as Nephice had been after defeating Gunlog? That could cost him his life. Not like I can do anything about it now. Full of unease, he continued his climb and soon reached the very top of the coral pillar. Standing on it, Sunny looked in the direction of the Dreamer army. Something wet suddenly fell on his hand. Looking down, he saw a drop of blood rolling off his skin. A moment later, another fell on the vambrace of the puppeteer's shroud. Surprised, Sunny raised his hand and swiped it across his upper lip. It came away wet with blood. A nosebleed? What the hell? Come to think of it, why did he feel so weak? As Sunny stared at his hand in confusion, a violent ripple suddenly ran through his shadow. Across the deep moat that surrounded the island, the remnants of the Dreamer army were at the precipice of turning the tide of battle in their favor. Just a few minutes ago, they had been drowning in the rising flood of black water and the relentless onslaught of the horde lost in the fury of a cataclysmic storm. But now, things were different. The storm was no more, and the dark sea had retreated. The sun shined brightly in the sky, drowning the battlefield in its light. Bathed in it, the nightmare creatures seemed to become hesitant, almost sluggish. They were not giving up, however. The monsters continued to attack the humans in a frenzied rage, their claws and fangs reaping one life after another. But the survivors of the Dreamer army were repaying every loss tenfold. Reinvigorated by the exhilarating gift of sudden salvation, they steeled their hearts and fought with zeal, fervor, and murderous will. More and more nightmare creatures fell to their blades, and the horde did not seem to be endless anymore. The sleepers did not know why the storm had dissipated and why the cursed sea had retreated, but their faith in Changing Star now burned even brighter. She had promised to guide them out of this hell, and somehow, even the Blackwater had capitulated to her radiant light. The victory was not impossible anymore. They could practically taste it, but Nephice herself suddenly stumbled and slowed her sword dance. A confused, alarmed frown appeared on her face. Dodging the claws of an attacking abomination, she thrust her sword into its maw, and then jumped back. Free of the swarming monsters for a few short moments, she lowered her sword and looked at the sky. High above her, Kai was still alive somehow. What is happening? He had spent so long flying at a terrible speed, struggling against the crushing wind, dodging bolts of lightning and the cursed spire messengers, pushing the limits of both his body and mind. The exhaustion was catching up with him now, making it hard to think, let alone react. He really didn't feel well. His whole body ached, and his vision was slowly turning blurry. A sickening feeling of weakness permeated his body. The storm had come out of nowhere and then disappeared without a trace. The skies were blindingly bright. That was a relief. But the damn abominations were still there. At least they didn't look tireless anymore. In fact, the messengers seemed to be in as much of a sorry state as Kai himself. He wanted to flatter himself and assume that it was because of his arrows. He had wounded the damned monsters many times, after all. But no, it didn't make any sense. They seemed able to resist the effect of the blood arrow before, at least to a large extent. So why would it change now? Something is wrong. Using the sun to blind his enemies, Kai dove into the light and dashed to the side, narrowly avoiding the claws of one of the messengers. Or so he thought. In reality, it wasn't narrow at all. He dodged it with a lot of room to spare. The quiet dancer didn't even need to get involved. Are they growing slower? With a sudden feeling of unease, Kai hesitated for a split second and then reduced his speed to take a good look at the terrifying creature. What he saw made him scowl. The messenger looked wrong. Its glassy black eyes were erratic and senseless. They were seeping with blood, which flowed down the black feathers like a crimson stream. There were two other similar streams, coming from the monster's ears. The muscles of his pale body were spasming, rolling under the white skin like panicking worms. As Kai watched, the messenger suddenly opened its beak in a silent scream. A moment later, a flood of blood erupted out of it and dispersed in the wind like red mist. Then, the creature convulsed one last time and lost control of its wings. Not even trying to correct itself, the terrible abomination plunged down. Kai flinched and opened his eyes wide in terror. The Spire Messenger was dead. Chapter 332 Siege of the Crimson Spire, 18. Sunny swayed a little and then looked down at his shadow. The shadow seemed to be in pain. It was slumped, clutching at its chest with one hand and waving at him with the other. When it noticed that Sunny was staring at it, it desperately pointed to itself. What is this guy trying to say? Was he having a heart attack? No, of course not. That would be ridiculous. Shadows didn't have hearts. What was it pointing at, then? Sunny scowled. The shadow was his reflection. So maybe it was not pointing at its own heart, but at his. But his heart felt fine. What else was there to point at? Suddenly, his eyes widened. The soul core. The soul core usually overlapped over a human's heart. With a shudder, Sunny dove into the soul sea. Instead of the usual peace and quiet, he was met by ominous chaos. The dark waters that were always tranquil and still were now restless and turbulent. They rippled and surged, as though under the assault of the invisible winds. Up above, the spheres of light that represented his memories shimmered and blinked, as if about to be extinguished. The black sun of the shadow core was trembling. He could almost see tiny cracks appear on its transparent surface. Only the silent shadows were still the same, not disturbed by the approaching disaster at all. They stood motionlessly, staring at him with no expression on their black, lifeless faces. Sunny did not pay them any attention and stared at the shadow core with wide eyes, dumbfounded. Soul damage. I am receiving soul damage. He was under the effect of a continuous soul attack. Escaping the unquiet sea in panic, Sunny wiped the blood off his face and looked around with a grim expression. He was even paler than usual. What the hell is attacking me? After a few moments, he suddenly shivered, stunned by a chilling revelation, and then looked up at the blinding disk of the sun. He had not been wrong. Its light was indeed much brighter than it had been before. The skies of the Forgotten Shore, which had always been gray, were now almost white, full of merciless heat and radiance. It looked as though someone had erased reality itself, leaving behind nothing but an endless white void. With each second, it was growing more and more incandescent. The sun, the source of the soul attack, was not a nightmare creature. It was sunlight itself. Anywhere it reached, the souls of living creatures were being slowly eroded and destroyed. And since the sun was now directly above them, at high noon, there was almost nowhere where it couldn't reach. There was no escape from it, except for Turning around, Sunny stared at the opened gates of the Crimson Spire. Behind them, welcoming darkness promised shade and safety. This was the only place where he could hide from the annihilating sun. The army. Spinning around, he peered across the moat. Out there on the battlefield, the nightmare creatures had stopped their endless onslaught. Now, they were stumbling and swaying, as though drunk. Many had already fallen to the ground, blood streaming from their orifices. Their souls had been destroyed, and they were dead. The surviving warriors of the Dreamer army were staring at them in bewilderment, their distant figures full of both relief and confusion. Sunny wanted to scream, warning them of the terrible danger they were in, but knew that he was too far away for anyone to hear him. From the tall mound of coral he was standing on, he could see the graceful, shining figure in their midst. He knew that Nephice must have figured out what was going on by now, but she didn't know that the gates of the spire were open. Think. Sunny lingered for a few seconds and then raised his hand. A moment later, a clear ringing of a silver bell spread across the labyrinth, rolling over the remains of the Dreamer army. Far away on the battlefield, Nephi spun and looked in his direction. Come on, Neph. Sunny rang the silver bell again and waved his hand in the air. However, there was no need. Changing Star had already moved, thrusting her sword toward the spire. In the next moment, the Dreamer army lunged forward. Sleepers were running with all the speed they could muster, following the command of their lady. Yes. Wait, what is she doing? Nephice herself did not follow her soldiers. Instead, she turned around and ran in the opposite direction, to the distant pillar of coral that they had left at the start of this mess. Sunny's heart skipped a bit when he realized that she was going back for Cassie. But there was nothing he could do to help, not anymore. Good luck. Jumping down from the mound, he rolled on the ground and ran toward the darkness of the spire's doorway without looking back. However, before Sunny could reach it, he saw something falling down from the skies. What the? A ragged human figure slammed into the crimson coral and rolled several times before coming to a stop, then remained still. Sunny dashed toward it, quickly recognizing the bright colors of Kai's armor. To his relief, the charming young man was still alive, if barely conscious. A graceful rapier was worriedly zipping in the air around him, the steel of its blade bleak and devoid of the usual luster. The two of them must have been high up in the sky when the soul erasure had begun, much closer to its source, and so suffered more than those of them on the ground. Not wasting any time, Sunny grabbed Kai by the collar and dragged him toward the opened gates of the spire. The quiet dancer followed. Soon, the three of them reached the border between light and darkness. Without hesitating even for a second, Sunny dove into the cool shade, made a few steps to get deeper into its shelter, and fell to the ground. Only now, protected from the annihilating sunlight by the solid mass of the ancient tower, he realized how terrible his condition had been. But no more. His soul was finally at peace once again, whatever wounds dealt to it already healing. Kai was still alive, too. Lucky bastard. Thank gods. That fool owes me big time now. Breathing heavily, he checked on the unconscious archer, then sat down and stared at the blindingly bright landscape outside. Were the others going to make it? A few seconds later, something suddenly flashed through the air. It was Castor. Falling on his knees near them, he glanced at Sunny with tired eyes and then gently placed an unconscious sleeper he had carried with him on the ground. Without saying anything, both of them then turned to the gates of the spire and looked into the light. Seconds passed in torturous silence. And then, a human silhouette appeared out of the brightness. And then another and another. The survivors of the Dreamer army had reached the island and dashed toward the life-saving darkness of the gargantuan tower. Soon, they crossed the distance separating them from the gates and dove into their shade. Sunny watched, something sharp moving in his chest. A torturous eternity later, he finally saw the familiar figure in white armor appear at the doorstep of the colossal structure. Carrying Cassie, Nephice entered the shadows. She was the last one to come. Looking at them and at the small crowd of sleepers gathered at the border between darkness and light, Sunny was finally able to exhale. They made it. The battle for the Crimson Spire was over. Now all they had to do was find the gateway hidden somewhere inside the ancient tower and survive the wrath of its master. Chapter 333 LN, The Belly of the Beast. Sitting on the cold stone floor, Sunny inhaled deeply and looked at the people that surrounded him. All of them were exhausted, wounded, covered in blood and dirt, barely staying conscious. Their armor was broken and torn, and their faces were deathly pale. They sat on the ground, too tired to move or talk, breathing heavily, and stared down with empty eyes. There were so few of them left, but also much more than he had expected. Around 100 sleepers had survived the Battle of the Crimson Spire. They were the strongest, the bravest, but mostly the luckiest warriors of the Dreamer army. 4/5 of it had been eviscerated in the slaughter. Not to mention another 500 or so that had died during the bloody struggle for the throne of the Bright Castle. This 100 was all that remained of more than 1,000 humans that had been surviving on the Forgotten Shore before Changing Star had arrived in the Dark City, like a brilliant omen of disaster, like a herald of ruinous change. But Sunny was appalled and horrified as much as he was surprised and elated. He had honestly thought that the number of people who would make it this far was going to be in the single digits. Looking around, he searched for familiar faces. Nephice and Cassie were there, of course. So was Kai. Effie was slumped against a wall, dressed only in her white chiton, which was now torn and painted completely red with blood. Her armor seemed to have been completely destroyed. Castor was also there, bandaging a shallow wound on his shoulder. Compared to other survivors, he seemed strangely clean. However, his armor was seriously damaged, too. It seemed that even incredible speed had not been enough to avoid the fury of the Nightmare Horde. Seishin stood slightly apart from the rest of them, surrounded by a dozen surviving handmaidens. The beautiful woman was heavily injured, the luster of her skin and sparkling eyes growing bleak and dim. From what Sunny could see, she was barely alive. He also noticed Aiko, who was sitting on the floor, wiping tears off her delicate face. But there were also many people whom he did not see. The scarred hunter who had welcomed them into the outer settlement after their long expedition was dead. So was Park, his nonchalant friend who had been responsible for turning Effie into a folk hero with his tales. The talkative watchman who had asked Sunny about his opinion on who could have killed Harus were now dead, too. So was the young man who had thought that talking to Sunny was a headache. Stev, the ample giant who had been in charge of the memory market during Gunlog's reign, did not make it. Perhaps this was why Aiko, his friend, was now silently shedding tears. Even Gemma, the dauntless leader of the Dark City Hunters, had perished. Sunny did not know what could have killed the seemingly immortal man but suspected that his last hunt had been a truly terrifying sight to behold. Most of the people Gemma had brought to Changing Star's faction with him were now dead, too. And so many more. Their absence pressed down on survivors like an unseen weight. But those who survived had no time for sorrow, at least not now. They weren't free of this nightmare yet. In fact, they had just entered the very belly of the beast. Turning away from the 100 sleepers, Sunny looked into the depths of the Crimson Spire. Once, the entire tower must have been hollow, but now there were growths of coral everywhere inside. They resembled frozen waterfalls of blood, as if rivers of it had once streamed from the top of the spire and then suddenly turned solid. Because of that, it was hard to see what was hidden in the depths of the cyclopic construct. Further away, the interior of the tower was shrouded in the cold darkness. Lingering for a few moments, Sunny decided not to send his shadow to explore. The Crimson Terror had already proven its ability to hurt it, so he was unwilling to risk the well-being of his invaluable helper. Instead, he glanced at Neff. Changing Star was peering into the growing brightness that drowned the Forgotten Shore. By now, the light of day outside was almost blinding. On her face, there was a strangely thoughtful expression. As Sunny watched, she turned around and raised her head, looking in the direction of the spire's tip. After a while, she frowned and then faced the surviving humans. Her calm voice echoed in the darkness of the ancient tower. "It's time to go. Gather your strength. We are almost there." The sleepers looked at her with tired eyes, the light of hope igniting in them with renewed strength. Slowly they rose to their feet. Those who were relatively fine supported those who were seriously wounded. Those who had lost consciousness were being carried by their friends or fellow warriors. Soon, the procession of humans headed deeper into the spire. Nephice was walking at the front, holding Cassie by the hand. Somehow, Sunny ended up side by side with them. Looking at the two young women, he wanted to say something, but no words came to his mind. Instead, Neff was the one who spoke. Glancing at Sunny, she hesitated for a while and then said, "Thank you for ringing that bell, and for everything." He looked at her for a long time and then shrugged. "There's no need to thank me. We are allies, are we not?" She smiled slightly and remained silent after that. Soon, they passed through the barrier of coral and approached the center of the spire. There, the dark sea was imprisoned under an indomitable seal. In front of them was a vast pool of black water. Its surface was perfectly still and flat, like that of a harrowing mirror made from pure darkness. Although the water was opaque and no one could see how far down that gargantuan well went, Sunny felt as though it was unimaginably deep. He felt that it reached such depths that the mere thought of light would be impossible there. As they watched in solemn silence, a subtle ripple spread across the surface of the imprisoned sea. It was as though it was straining to spill over the edges of the pool and break free. However, the invisible powers that held it down were too mighty to overcome, even for this vast, boundless, inconceivable creature. Turning away from the eerie black mirror, Sunny peered into the darkness and frowned. Hidden in the shadows, far away from the light of human lanterns, countless figures were standing motionlessly, staring at them. Chapter 334 Silver Sword. At first, Sunny wanted to shout to warn everyone, but after observing the silent figures for a few moments, he changed his mind. Hidden in darkness, countless coral golems were staring mindlessly into the distance. They were very similar to the creatures he had fought to get to the Star Sigil, but also different. Because they weren't copies of ancient heroes, just that of mundane people. As such, they wouldn't be too dangerous. A single sleeper could fight dozens with ease, let alone the experienced, powerful warriors of the Dreamer army. More than that, the golems did not seem to be hostile. Some of them stood motionlessly, while some aimlessly wandered about. These sad, empty things were even more lifeless than echoes. He felt that they weren't really creatures, even. Just physical manifestations of the Crimson Terror's madness, perhaps. A representation of its broken psyche and scattered thoughts. He was sure that each of these golems represented one of the souls that had been sacrificed to the artificial sun and had once flowed through its vessel, becoming a part of it. Forever. There were thousands of them, and even more had to be hidden somewhere out of sight. Lingering for a bit, Sunny informed Nephice of his discovery. She frowned and glanced into the darkness, then nodded. "We will be careful." Now that they had a better understanding of the ground level of the Crimson Spire, it became clear that the gateway was not on it. To find it, the remains of the Dreamer army were going to have to ascend higher. There were no stairs or lifting mechanisms in sight, but luckily, many of the twisting coral pillars were wide enough for several people to walk on them and not as steep as to make things too difficult. The sleepers could use them to easily reach the next level. However, as soon as Sunny stepped forward, Neff suddenly pulled him back and shouted, "Everyone back." Just a moment later, a wide ray of blinding light fell from somewhere above and swiped across the interior of the Crimson Spire, annihilating the tranquil darkness. It didn't take a genius to realize that the ray was imbued with the same soul-destroying property as the deadly beams of sunlight outside. Only this one seemed much more powerful. It was also different. Although its movements were erratic and strange, they were unmistakably aimed at the exhausted mass of human invaders and full of intent. Hide in the shadows. Swiftly, the sleepers dove behind growths of coral and pressed themselves against them. A few unfortunate ones lingered for too long and were exposed to the light. They didn't scream or struggle, just fell down to the ground, their lives extinguished in a split moment. The rest froze, consumed by tense fear. Sunny found himself leaning against a slightly inclined pillar of coral, Neph and Cassie by his side. Carefully looking out, he saw the deadly beam of light grow dim and dissipate. A moment later, however, several more fell from above, tearing the darkness apart. But that was not all. Guided by the light, the mass of coral golems suddenly surged forward, moving toward the place where the Dreamer army was hiding. Their movements, which were aimless and mindless before, were now full of malevolent will. Crap. Turning to Nephice, he summoned the Midnight Shard and asked, "What now?" She lingered for a bit, and then said evenly, "Someone will have to attack the Crimson Terror directly to draw its attention away." Sunny smiled, feeling a strong sense of déjà vu. And who might that be? Changing Star sighed and took a step back, summoning her silver sword.
Me.
It has to be me. He frowned, feeling very reluctant to say his next words. But in the end, he still couldn't help but say them. Are you crazy? That's a fallen terror we're talking about. Nephice didn't answer, instead looking up, as though trying to discern the source of the blinding rays of annihilating light. Sunny gritted his teeth and added, "All right, whatever. Say someone really needs to distract that thing. But why does it have to be you alone? Because you are the great daughter of the Immortal Flame Clan? Don't tell me that you started to believe in your own bullcrap." Neph gave him a strange look and then shook her head.
No.
It can only be me because of my sword. Sunny stared at the silver longsword, confused. A lifetime ago, after their first meeting on the Forgotten Shore, Nephice and Cassie had told him about their memories. The sword in particular had an extremely rare enhancement. I am the only human on the Forgotten Shore who has a memory that grants them a measure of protection against soul attacks. So I am the only one who can approach the terror and survive. It was hard to debate against logic. Still, Sunny was not done voicing his objections, only that Changing Star didn't give him a chance to. Turning to Cassie, she took the blind girl by the hand and said,
Gah.
"Give me your wing cloak." A few seconds later, the transparent fabric of the dark wing appeared on her shoulder. Without wasting any time, she then looked at Sunny. "Once I'm gone, lead the people to the gateway. Make sure that everyone escapes." With that, Nephice bent her knees and then jumped with all her might. Supported by the enchanted cloak, she shot up with considerable speed, then pushed herself off the pillar of coral and flew into the darkness. The ray of light swiped in her direction, but Changing Star somehow managed to dodge it, crashed into another coral growth, and launched herself off of it a moment before another annihilating beam of light reached it. With most rays now pursuing Nephice as she leaped from one coral pillar to another, ascending higher and higher, the Dreamer army could once again move. Gritting his teeth, Sunny glanced at the 100 frightened people and yelled, "Follow me." Chapter 335 Ascent. Sunny had never expected to become a leader of anyone, let alone of 100 desperate people. But now, that was exactly the situation he found himself in. To add insult to injury, he was really the best person for the job. Not because of any kind of leadership qualities, but simply for the fact that he could see in the dark. Now that the rays of soul-destroying light were led away by Nephice, he could also let his shadow free and send it forward to explore and search for the gateway. So, if anyone could guide the remains of the Dreamer army to it, it was him. How the hell? Hiding his unease deep inside, Sunny projected nothing but absolute confidence and shouted for everyone to follow him. Surprisingly, the sleepers did just that without voicing any objections. Confidence is easily confused for competence, I guess. Of course, the fact that he was affiliated with Changing Star in some capacity helped a lot, even if most people were not completely sure how and to what extent. Taking Cassie's hand, Sunny dove out of his cover and dashed toward a wide, spiraling coral route that reached high into the darkness above. He could hear the sound of footsteps following him from behind. The Dreamer army was on the move once again. Jumping on the route, Sunny sent the shadow forward and glanced at the approaching sea of coral golems. There was still time. He ran forward, using the coral growth as stairs. A second later, he yelled, "Those at the back, ready your weapons." They did so, while the first rows of sleepers followed Sunny up. Almost everyone had time to climb onto the root by the time the first of the golems showed up. The coral figure stumbled from the darkness, only to be met by a flash of a sword. It crumbled instantly, offering almost no resistance. But a moment later, several more appeared, and then more and more. The sleepers destroyed the first wave to buy themselves a few moments and then jumped onto the root, then dashed away, soon catching up with the rest of the survivors. At the head of them, Sunny hesitated for a moment. Thanks to the shadow, he knew that the wide coral growth they were ascending was soon going to twist upward at an almost vertical angle and grow much more narrow. Luckily, there was another one crossing it just a few meters ahead, separated by a very small gap. Picking Cassie up, he took a step forward and jumped, landing on the other root, then turned around and moved in the opposite direction to the one they had been going but still upward. Behind him, the sleepers repeated his jump. And down below, the wave of golems was already climbing on the twisting roots to pursue them. Damn it, I guess they can climb. He ran forward, struggling against the steep incline, then suddenly froze and looked up. There, a few dozen meters away, a wide gallery circled around the empty expanse of the Crimson Spire. And on it, another mass of golems was surging in the direction of the Dreamer army. Countless twisted figures were appearing from the chaotic mess of crimson coral and rushing forward, searching for a path to reach them. Many fell off the edge of the gallery and plunged down, to explode into shards once they hit the floor. But some fell right on the root he was standing on. Gritting his teeth, Sunny looked back and noticed a familiar tall figure close by. Effie stared at him tiredly and forced out a smile. What is it now? He put Cassie on the ground and gently pushed her toward the huntress. Take care of her for me, all right? Effie waved a hand, letting him know that she got it. Sunny watched the two of them for a moment, then turned around and summoned the Midnight Shard. A few seconds later, he reached the first golem and slashed it with his sword. The golem's body offered some resistance, but no more than a mundane creature would. It almost disintegrated under his assault, crumbling easily into a pile of broken coral. Not too bad. Curiously, the spell did not congratulate him on the kill. Just as Sunny had suspected, these things were not really living creatures. That was going to make things a tiny bit easier. Running past the destroyed construct, Sunny soon approached another one and pushed it off the root with one strike of the Midnight Shard's pommel. The golems were not that dangerous, at least not in small numbers. He led the Dreamer army forward, climbing higher and higher. Every couple of minutes, they would have to leave one route and make use of another, sometimes moving across stone galleries that were situated here and there on the walls of the Crimson Spire. At some point, both the vanguard of the human procession and its rear became embroiled in a rolling melee with the sea of coral golems. Those in the middle only had to keep their eyes on the layers of coral and stone structures overhead to make sure that nothing fell on them. This battle was not too terrible, however. The constructs were slower and weaker than even the mundane humans whose visage they were meant to recreate, not to mention almost completely mindless. Not a single human had fallen to their attacks yet. That was not to say that surviving the onslaught of countless golems was easy. Somewhere high above, meanwhile, the flashes of white light slowly turned into one continuous, radiant halo. Nephice was probably already approaching the very pinnacle of the ancient tower. The fact that none of the annihilating rays had returned to attack the sleeper served as proof that she was still alive, drawing the attention of the terror away from them. Where are you? Where are you? At the head of the Dreamer army, Sunny cut through another golem and suppressed a curse. Where was the damn gateway? And just as he thought that, the shadow finally found what it had been looking for all that time. Their way back to the real world. Chapter 330, 6 The Gateway. Out there in the darkness, a vast balcony was built into the wall of the tower, reaching almost to the center of the gargantuan structure. On its surface, broken pillars of marble were overgrown by the ever-present streaks of crimson coral. They led to a circular dais, with a wide iron ring submerged into its stone surface. Around the ring, a beautiful pattern of runes was shimmering with familiar light. They were just like those runes that every awakened had seen countless times when communicating with the spell. But that wasn't the first reason why Sunny had noticed it. The most unusual thing about the dais was that unlike everything else inside of the spire, it was utterly devoid of growths of crimson coral. The stone surface surrounding the ring was strangely clean and untouched by it. Looking at the shimmering runes and the iron rings through his shadow, Sunny felt something move in his heart. He was sure that this was the gateway. They were so close. As he watched it, the whole spire suddenly shuddered. Massive pieces of coral broke off and fell down, crashing into other branches down below. Suddenly, the darkness that surrounded the Dreamer army became less impenetrable. High above them, the radiant halo of light became several times more bright. Nephice had reached the Crimson Terror. With a somber grimace, Sunny escaped from his reverie and dashed forward, slicing several golems as he went. The frightened sleepers followed, entrusting their fates into his hands. As more and more tremors ran through the ancient tower and several enormous pillars of coral completely collapsed, they ascended even higher and approached the vast balcony. And then, finally, Sunny jumped down and landed on a solid stone. Shattering a few golems, he cleared enough space for others to follow and watched several more people reach the balcony. One after another, the sleepers jumped off the treacherous coral and joined him. Those who were the first to catch up repelled the attacking golems to let the others come down. Soon, all 100 of them were on the balcony, and just in time. A few seconds later, a tremendous piece of debris fell from above, pulverizing the branch of coral they had used to get there. Sunny lingered for a few moments, watching as crimson pieces rained down, and then turned away with a determined expression. Come on. We're almost there. The remains of the Dreamer army cut through the mass of golems and escaped it. Running with all the speed they could manage, the crowd of young men and women approached the gateway and froze, stunned by the sight of it, hypnotized by it. In front of them was the hope that they had forgotten for so long. The torturous promise of freedom that had taunted them every day, hidden away in the terrifying, looming silhouette of the Crimson Spire. Their way home. Salvation. Most of them had spent so long on the forgotten shore that the thought of ever being able to escape it became nothing more than a distant dream. Even when they had followed Changing Star and chose to believe her promises, salvation was just a concept. An idea. Now that they saw it as a real thing, many did not know how to react. Well, Sunny was there to make the process easier. What are you staring at, idiots? Pick up your jaws and move. Battle formation. Protect the rear. Wounded and non-combatants go first. Everyone else holds off the damn golems and then follows. One at a time. Bastards. Coming back to their senses thanks to his angry shout, the sleepers quickly reorganized themselves. Those who could still fight faced away from the gateway and formed a defensive line, protecting the wounded with their bodies. Those who couldn't help the people in the worst condition enter the iron ring. Sunny watched as the first human was placed in the center of the gateway. A moment later, the runes surrounding the ring flashed with shimmering light. The body of the sleeper suddenly shone, too. The ghostly shine was dim at first, but then grew brighter and brighter. Soon, it was hard to distinguish the shape of the human body at the center of that light. And then, the light dissipated, much like a memory or an echo would, leaving nothing behind. After all these years, all that suffering, all that loss, the first sleeper had finally escaped the forgotten shore. Looking through the emptiness left by the disappearance, Sunny realized that he had forgotten to breathe. A second later, an exhilarated cheer rose above the crowd of humans. The intensity of emotion in their voices, no words existed to describe the complicated, overwhelming conflagration of feelings burning in the chests of the survivors of the Dreamer army at that moment. Well, at least Sunny had none. In the next moment, the pursuing wave of golems crashed into the defensive line, and the next humans stepped into the gateway. The defenders held their ground, throwing the coral creatures back. Sunny lingered at the edge of the dais, watching the crowd of humans. One after another, they were disappearing into the beautiful radiance of the gateway, while the others continued to confidently repel the assault of the golems. They were going to survive. That meant that his job here was done. And, just as he had expected, Castor was nowhere to be seen. Lingering for a few short moments, Sunny glanced at the gateway one last time and then stepped away. As he moved through the crowd of humans and approached its edge, someone suddenly called out his name. Turning his head, Sunny saw Effie. The huntress was carrying the unconscious body of Kai on one shoulder and keeping Cassie close to her own under another. The blind girl's face was ashen, confused, and empty. "Doofus, where are you going?" Sunny stared at her for a few moments and then suddenly smiled. "There's just some unfinished business I need to deal with. Take care, you three. I will see you later. I hope." With that, he took a step back and disappeared into the shadows. Chapter 337 Nobody. Summoning the Dark Wing and the Prowling Thorn, Sunny jumped off the edge of the stone balcony. In the next second, his dagger pierced the darkness and bit into a fractured coral branch high above. With a sharp pull, Sunny sent himself flying upward, the transparent cloak turning into a blur behind his back. All around him, the interior of the Crimson Spire, which remained unchanged for thousands of years, was shifting. The ancient tower continued to shudder and quake as it endured the calamitous consequences of the battle between Changing Star and the vessel of the artificial sun. Vast coral roots were shattering and plunging down, drowning the echoing expanse of the spire with deafening clangor. As massive slabs of coral collided against lower branches, they were pulverized in turn. Moving through all this destruction, Sunny struggled to stay alive. Before he could even reach the route he had been aiming for, it was obliterated by falling debris. The mass of coral then rained down, threatening to bury Sunny under its deadly weight. Not fazed, he twisted and hurled the Prowling Thorn sideways, then flew out of the way of the collapsing coral. Just a second later, Sunny hit the side of an intact root and pushed himself off its surface, continuing to ascend. He spun and twisted, using the Prowling Thorn and every surface he could reach to dodge the falling slabs of coral, avoid being cut to pieces by deadly clouds of flying splinters, and soar higher and higher. As he did, the shadow jumped from one root to another, searching for Castor. The Legacy was much faster than Sunny, but was chained to the ground and didn't have the advantage of being able to see in the dark. Sunny was certain that he would be able to catch up to him before too long. And after a few torturous minutes, he inevitably did. Emerging from a cloud of coral dust, Sunny left a crimson trail in the air as he landed on a wide route in a nimble roll. A moment later, he jumped his feet and stood silently in the darkness, waiting for Castor to appear. Up here, at the highest levels of the spire, the chaos was not as pronounced. Those branches of coral that were going to break had already fallen, and the few remaining ones were relatively stable. That allowed Sunny to predict which route the Legacy was going to take. The cool, polished wood of the Weaver's mask rested comfortably on his face, hiding his features. Sunny wasn't sure what resources and connections the Hanley clan possessed, so he chose to be extra careful. He was wary of someone tracing Castor's death back to him with the help of a prophetic aspect ability or some strange and powerful memory. A vengeful Legacy clan was the last thing he would want to deal with after returning to the real world. And by now, he was sure that one of the two of them was going to die here, in this cursed and dreadful tower. This confrontation was long overdue. He was also wary of Castor himself. The proud scion was many things, but a fool was not one of them. There was a chance that he had long guessed Sunny's flaw. The mask was his insurance against that eventuality. Let's see which one of us is better. Let's see which one of us deserves it more. For Sunny, this fight was not only about defeating Castor. It wasn't even about defending Neff. It was about defeating the world itself. A lifetime ago, when he and Castor had first met in the academy, they were on opposite sides of humanity. One was on the top, and the other was on the bottom. One was strong and surrounded by a circle of admirers, and the other one was weak and alone. One had the best education, the best mentors, the vast resources of his powerful family, the inherited arsenal of memories, and plenty of soul shards to propel him forward to future success. The other had nothing. Sunny had always had nothing. No family and no home, no place to call his own, No one to care about whether he lived or died. No opportunity, no chance, no future. Thrust into the same hell as Castor, he clawed and fought, suffered and endured, survived and bettered himself through will, intellect, and countless brushes with death. And now, a year later, he was ready to claim his rightful place. By defeating Castor, he was going to prove once and for all that he wasn't lesser than anyone. That he wasn't some inconsequential nobody to be discarded and forgotten, to be lost on the pages of history. That he mattered as much as those real humans did. That he was as exceptional as the best of them, despite the fact that he wasn't born into wealth and prosperity. Much more so, even. As Sunny waited in the darkness, the light of a memory lantern swiftly approached from below. Castor was rushing to the pinnacle of the spire, using his incredible speed and training to avoid being killed by the falling debris. He was already getting close when, suddenly, the light of his lantern fell on a motionless figure that stood in the center of a wide coral route, barring his way. Dark armor weaved out of soft fabric, with lusterless black leather protecting vital spots. An austere blade held lightly, its tip turned to the ground. The wooden mask that resembled the face of a fearsome demon was new, but still, he had no problem recognizing who was in front of him. Slowing down and stopping a few meters away from the hateful little vagrant, Castor gritted his teeth and spat. "It's you." Hidden behind the mask, Sunny smiled.
No.
"You are mistaken. Actually, it's not me." Then, tilting his head, he stared at the proud legacy and said, his voice full of surprise.
"Oh."
"Hey, Castor. What a coincidence to run into you here of all places. So unexpected. It must be fate." Chapter 338 Rest of the Mongrels. Castor remained silent for a while, then calmly looked up at the furiously pulsating radiance of the Crimson Terror's light. Finally, he lowered his head and exhaled through gritted teeth. "Out of my way, Sunny." Sunny blinked a couple of times, then said in a humorless tone, "Or what?" The legacy grimaced and stared at him darkly, his face full of resentment. "I am so tired of you and your insolence. Why must you always ruin everything? Why can't you just know your place?" Summoning his beautiful Jian, Castor shook his head and said, "Stay out of this if you value your life. This is the last chance I am going to give you." Sunny did not move, watching the young man silently. There was nothing but darkness in the eyes of the disturbing black mask. A few moments later, his voice resounded from behind it, strangely hollow. "Know my place? What is my place in your eyes? Huh, Castor?" The legacy smiled slightly and then said naturally, as though stating a fact, "Out of the sight of those better than you, with the rest of the mongrels. What else?" Sunny shifted slightly. When he spoke, his tone was unexpectedly carefree and friendly. Not exactly what I expected to hear. Well, never mind. Before we do this, though, can I ask you one question?" Castor snarled.
"Sure."
"Go ahead." This was something that had been pressing on Sunny's mind for a long time. "Why do you even want to kill Nephice? What is so important that you are even willing to risk your life?" The legacy looked at him with no humor in his eyes. After a few moments, he said in a strange tone, "This is not something that you, scum, will ever understand. Survival is all you creatures care about. Duty, loyalty, honor. Those are the words the likes of you know nothing about. So, I will put it in a way that will be easy even for you to comprehend." He pierced him with an intense gaze and said, each word falling like an avalanche, "The immortal flame must be destroyed." And then, his voice ringing with profound inevitability, Castor added, "This is the will of the sovereigns." Sunny stared at him for a bit, engrossed in the solemn atmosphere of this proclamation. A few seconds later, in a sincerely confused tone, he asked, Who?" Castor's eyes widened. He looked at Sunny with a dumbfounded expression, then shook his head in disbelief. "Wait, you really don't know? She didn't tell you anything?" Sunny scratched the back of his head. "Of course she did. Actually, I know exactly what you're talking about. I've been told everything. No one knows more than me on this topic, really." The legacy stared at him for a few moments, then suddenly threw his head back and laughed out loud. Pathetic mongrel, you don't even know who you serve. You don't even know who rules the world you live in. Why am I even wasting my breath talking to a worm like you? Sunny tilted his head, then said in a reproachful tone,
Ouch.
That stings. Castor smiled darkly, then raised his sword. Enough of this. I'm done trying to reason with you, fool. I have allowed you to skulk in the shadows, playing your vulgar games, for long enough. I only permitted you to live because there was no reason to get rid of you. What, do you think that you can defeat me? That your little schemes and secrets give you a chance against a true legacy? Sorry to disappoint, but I figured them out a long time ago. Sunny remained silent for a bit, and then asked in an indifferent tone, Oh yeah?
Do tell.
What are my secrets, exactly? The legacy grinned. You hide your strength and pretend to be weak. You go around telling ridiculous tales, making everyone think that you are a lunatic. At first, I thought that you had lost your mind, too. But once I started paying attention, it was so obvious. The constant misdirections, the obnoxious bragging that no sane person would ever believe, the crazy act. This is your flaw, isn't it? As Sunny tensed, Castor smiled triumphantly and said, You are compelled to lie against your will. Did you really think that no one would see the pattern? You even bribed that idle friend of yours to try and mislead everyone. A pathetic attempt. Were you expecting that anyone would buy it? Sunny stared at him for a few moments and then exploded with laughter. Ah, crap. You got me. Yes, you are right.
This is my flaw.
What sane person would go around telling such outrageous lies? Then, he pierced Castor with a murderous gaze and said, Sadly, it seems that I am at a disadvantage in that regard. It is such a shame that I have no idea what your flaw is, huh? That I haven't figured it out a long time ago, too. Castor looked at him, a corner of his mouth turning downward. In the light of the memory lantern, he looked handsome and confident. Mature. There was a short beard on his face and a few gray hairs in his luscious mane. Hidden behind the mask, Sunny smiled. It is so sad that I don't know that your powerful, incredible, amazing aspect ability shortens your lifespan every time you use it, and that you reverse its effect on your body with a charm memory in the shape of a sandglass. Ah, if only I was more observant. Too bad I am not. The legacy stared at him with a dark expression, his face slowly turning pale. After a while, he uttered, It doesn't matter. After I fulfill my duty and return to the real world, the awakening will allow me to take back the years that had been stolen from me. While you, rat, will stay in this cursed place FO. Before he was done talking, a heavy triangular blade suddenly flew into his face. As a hint of outrage gleamed in Castor's eyes, he easily swatted the kunai away and turned into a blur, lunging at Sunny with astonishing speed. Invisible to a human eye, the string of the prowling thorn was wrapped around two coral outcroppings, drawn across the wide route right ahead of him. And the proud legacy was about to. A green light flashed through the air, and Sunny felt his wrist jerk back, the tension of the string suddenly gone. CR. A fraction of a second later, Castor's upon him. Chapter 339 Harder. Better. Faster, stronger. Fast, too fast. Castor was moving with astonishing speed, his figure turning into a blur. His flaw was a cruel one, but the power of the aspect ability he possessed was also incredible. In fact, Sunny had never met anyone with an ability as powerful as this, with the exception of himself and Nephice. Even the greatest warriors on the Forgotten Shore would have had no chance against it. Gemma, Effie, Saishin, all of them would have been easily killed by the deadly scion of the Hanli clan. Perhaps only Harus could have fought him to a draw. But even then, Sunny wasn't sure. Not only did Castor possess a terrifying ability, but he was also one of the most skilled swordsmen of their generation. He also had a whole arsenal of memories hidden away inside his soul. Surely, he had a way to fight while blinded. That's why Sunny did not waste any time trying to destroy the memory lantern illuminating their surroundings. Instead, he just trusted his sword and met Castor's attack with his own. Two swords collided in the air, and in the next moment, Castor flew past Sunny and slowed down, eventually coming to a stop. A drop of blood fell off the tip of his jian. Sunny staggered. "Curse you!" The sleeve of the puppeteer's shroud was torn, and there was a shallow cut on his shoulder. He had managed to deflect the strike aimed at his heart, but wasn't fast enough to avoid being wounded after all. On Castor's face, there was a dark expression. Looking at Sunny, who was still alive, he grimaced and spat. "Not bad. This is going to be entertaining, at least." Hidden behind the mask, Sunny grinned. "Oh yeah, I'm having a lot of fun myself, thanks." Of course, that was a lie. Back in the academy, Castor had been the only person to defeat Nephice. Granted, all of them had been much weaker back then. Neph also had not used her aspect ability, while Sunny was using his to augment himself right now. Because of it, the gap in speed between the two of them was not completely lethal. And yet, he was incomparably slower. In terms of pure physical ability, Sunny had no hope of surviving this duel. But he already knew the secret of how one had to fight against Castor. He had learned it from Changing Star herself, during that short and fateful spar. A year ago, Nephice had been in a similar situation, and yet almost defeated her swift enemy. She had anticipated Castor's moves instead of reacting to them, and due to that, his speed advantage had been made less severe. This was what Sunny had to do now. Of course, to achieve such a feat, one had to possess an intricate understanding of the underlying laws of combat and a true mastery of both their mind and their body. Luckily, Sunny was one such man. He had obtained clarity a long time ago and spent every waking hour sharpening his skill and instincts. His mind had entered into the state of flow, making his perception stark and all-encompassing, his thoughts quicker. His intuition was enhanced by the knowledge of the essence of battle. That gave him a chance to win. A moment later, Castor attacked again, and Sunny jerked the Midnight Shard sideways, blocking the ghostly green jian at the last possible moment. Up. He had begun to chain the next move even before the two blades collided. A split second later, the Legacy brought down his sword in a downward slash, aiming at Sunny's head. However, it was deflected, thrust at the neck. Once again, sliding down the length of the Tachi and biting Sunny on the shoulder. This time, the leather pauldron of his armor held, but just barely. Almost instantly, Castor pulled the jian back and then immediately thrust it forward, aiming to cut the enemy's throat. The Midnight Shard awkwardly pushed the gleaming blade away, but not fast enough. Another shallow cut appeared on Sunny's neck, seeping with blood. Damn it! Infuriated, Sunny tried to counterattack, but was forced to concentrate on nothing but defense. Dozens of strikes rained on him in a span of a couple of seconds, filling the echoing expanse of the Crimson Spire with the clangor of steel. More and more cuts appeared on his body. None of them were too deep or dangerous, but that didn't make them less painful. No matter how cunning and perfect Sunny's movements were, he couldn't make up for his lack of speed completely. Months of training, hundreds of battles, countless hours spent gaining insight into the inner workings of swordsmanship. Castor had done all of that, too, and then some.
And he was so much faster.
But somehow, Sunny was still alive. Not only was he alive, he wasn't even seriously injured yet. At some point, he feinted a block and dodged the blade of Castor's sword instead, then whipped his empty head forward, as though trying to punch the Legacy in the head. At the last moment, however, a ghostly stiletto appeared in his hand, only to be thrown aside by a powerful hit of the jian. Sunny barely managed to save his arm from being severed at the wrist. Sparing him a contemptuous glance, Castor snarled, "Creedon, have you forgotten that I was there when Changing Star gave you that memory?" Sunny gritted his teeth and lashed out with the austere Tachi, buying himself a moment to regroup. "I guess it slipped my mind." With that, he suddenly hurled the Moonlight Shard at the Legacy, then followed it with a fearsome thrust of his sword. Castor easily dodged the stiletto, deflected the Tachi, and kicked him in the stomach, sending Sunny staggering back with a pained moan. For a fraction of a second, he was wide open. His enemy did not miss that opportunity, turning into a blur as he lunged forward. The gleaming jian flashed through the air, and at the same time, Sunny suddenly spun and twisted his body. The two of them almost brushed against each other as Castor flew by. A moment later, Sunny shuddered and bent over, blood streaming from a deep wound on his side. The legacy turned around and smiled cruelly, a hint of satisfaction reflecting in his eyes. "Not so boisterous now, are you, worm?" Sunny groaned and slowly straightened his back, pressing one hand against his bleeding side. His voice sounded strained and solemn.
"Ah, yes."
That didn't go exactly as planned. Then, he tilted his head and raised his other hand, staring at the object dangling from a torn chain that was gripped in it. Suddenly, Castor's hand shot toward his neck. "You." Sunny grinned and dangled the sandglass charm in the air. "Wait, wow. How did this thing get here?" Castor gritted his teeth, and the stolen memory immediately began to radiate a subtle, white glow. He was trying to dismiss the charm and return it to his soul core. Before that happened, however, Sunny caught it and clenched his fist, ruthlessly shattering the crystal hourglass into tiny pieces. Castor's eyes widened. "Bastard." As his shout resounded in the darkness, the shards of the precious memory flew to the ground, turning into sparks of light and disappearing as they fell. Chapter 340 Honor. For a few seconds, both of them stood without motion. On Castor's face, shock and disbelief were mixed with fury, indignation, and fear. Slowly, he raised his head and pierced Sunny with a hateful gaze. "You scum." His voice was trembling with suppressed rage.
"Good."
Rage is good. Anything that makes him lose control is G. In the next moment, Sunny got hit in the chest and flew back with a pained scream. Although he somehow managed to deflect the tip of the enchanted Jian, the legacy still ended up slamming into him like a speeding train. The blade of his sword pierced the puppeteer's shroud once again, slicing Sunny's forearm. Goddamn it. This was just unfair. The shroud was a Tier 5 memory of the awakened rank. Where did the bastard find a weapon that could cut through it so easily? Well, Sunny more or less knew where. Who was to say that the ghostly green Jian wasn't of the same tier, if not higher? Legacy clans had a lot of powerful memories in their treasuries. Unlike him. Hitting the ground in a roll, Sunny dashed to the side and used the pommel of the midnight shard to slam Castor's hand away. He barely saved himself from being decapitated. Shaken, Sunny threw a handful of coral dust into the air and retreated. A moment later, his enemy emerged from the dust like a vengeful demon. The damned Jian was once again aimed at his heart. But the Castor looked different. It seemed that Sunny was right on the money with his guess about the proud scion's flaw and the purpose of the mysterious charm memory. Before, Castor had already looked slightly older than the other members of the cohort, which was strange, considering that both Effie and Kai were supposed to be the oldest among them. This was what had initially caught Sunny's attention because back at the academy, there had been no such difference. However, now that the crystal sandglass was broken, time seemed to be catching up with the legacy. If anyone were to see him now, they would have assumed that he was in his late 20s, perhaps even early 30s. He still resembled the youth that Sunny had met just a year ago, but just barely. Instead, a handsome, mature, powerful man was attacking him, his dark skin still smooth, but already showing the signs of future wrinkles at the corners of his eyes and mouth. There were several silver hairs in his beard. Straining every muscle in his body, Sunny stood his ground and parried the deadly thrust, then dodged to the left. Once again, he was a fraction of a second late, and another cut appeared on his body. Curses! With a pained grimace, Sunny dodged, evaded, parried, and blocked, continuing to retreat and create distance between himself and Castor. At some point, a furious roar made his ears ring. "Get back here, you rat! Why are you running like a coward?" Hidden behind the mask and struggling to breathe, Sunny gritted his teeth and hissed. No reason in particular. The next time he and Castor clashed, the legacy appeared to be in his late 30s. Now he resembled a man in his prime. His powerful physique became even more formidable, his broad shoulders straining the metal of the sturdy scale armor. His temples were gray, and his beard had silver streaks running through it. He looked like the kind of older man young girls would be utterly smitten by. Sunny groaned as he felt another laceration appear on his body, pushed Castor away, and then dashed back. The midnight shard flew from one side to another, from low to high, not stopping even for a split second. The ringing of steel fused into a continuous, deafening clamor. He felt as though his lungs were on fire, but couldn't allow himself to slow down ever for a moment. A momentary lapse was going to cost him his life. Come on, this is not much worse than facing against Saint, but it was worse. So much worse. Even while augmented by the shadow, Sunny couldn't resist Castor's furious onslaught. He was stronger and much more resilient, but that was the thing about sharp weapons. They were created to make the amount of force required to kill someone much less demanding. A skilled swordsman that relied on speed could dispatch an enemy with one well-aimed touch of the blade. To someone like Sunny, Castor was a nightmare. If not for the blood weave, he would have grown weak and slow from blood loss a long time ago, just from the numerous cuts on his body. And yet, he resisted and continued to retreat, desperately deflecting one lightning-fast strike after another. The next time Sunny got a good look at the proud legacy, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Attacking him was an old man. His gaunt face was laced with a spiderweb of wrinkles, and his hair and beard were completely gray. There was almost no sign left of the handsome youth he had known and despised for so long. Castor was still full of power and vigor, though. His fury was still as murderous and scathing as it had been before. His speed, however, was just a tiny bit slower. Die, mongrel. With a furious roar, Castor brought down the ghostly Jian down on Sunny, who was still reeling from the previous blow. Desperate, Sunny raised his tachi into an awkward semblance of a block. When their swords collided, the midnight shard flew aside and almost slid from his hands. What's worse, Sunny lost his balance and fell backward, landing on the ground in a heap. As a cruel smile appeared on the old man's weathered face, he lunged forward to finish the defenseless enemy. But at the last second, a calm voice resounded from behind his back. The voice he hated, but knew so well. Standing somewhere behind him, Nephice ordered in a tone that denied refusal. Back. Castor's eyes widened. With an expression of utter terror, he spun around and raised his sword, ready to finally face the person he had dreaded and wanted to kill for so long. However, when he did, he saw nothing but emptiness. There was no one behind him, just a simple rock lying on the ground. As Castor watched in confusion, his thoughts slow due to the debilitating effect of age, the rock shouted in Changing Star's voice. Hide in the shadows. Almost immediately, the proud scion's pupils narrowed. With a dark grimace, he spun back, moving his sword into a defensive position. He was just a fraction of a second late. Without making any sound, the tip of the midnight shard pierced his scale armor, his flesh, and then his heart. Staring at the stunned face of the feeble old man in front of him, Sunny scowled and sighed. Castor looked down, at the blade protruding from his chest and the blood streaming from beneath, then weakly grabbed the tachi with his hand. A pained, resentful grimace contorted his pale, wrinkled face. Straining to raise his head, he looked Sunny in the eyes and whispered, You have no honor. Sunny stared at the dying old man with pity, then looked away. There is honor indeed. Honor is not just a word powerful scumbags invented to make young fools like you die for them and kill for them. It's not a chain that they wrapped around your neck to make you a slave. Castor looked at him for a few moments, trying to say something, but then slowly fell to his knees. In the sudden silence, the voice of the spell whispered, You have slain a dormant human, Hanli Castor. Your shadow grows stronger. Chapter 340-1000. Standing above Castor's corpse, Sunny tilted his head slightly. Despite his expectations, there was not a lot of joy in his heart. Instead, defeating the powerful scion of a true legacy clan left him feeling somber and a little bitter. There was, however, a sense of, if not validation, then at least vindication. It was as though some profound need in his soul was finally satisfied, making it more solid, steady. With a pained groan, Sunny took a step back, turned around, and dismissed the weaver's mask. He was in better shape than he had expected to be. Countless cuts on his body were painful, but not dangerous. Blood weave was diligently doing its job, preventing him from losing too much of the precious red liquid. The cuts were already starting to scab over and close. The only serious wound was the gash on his side, but it, too, had already stopped bleeding. Very soon it was going to start healing too. Until then, it was not going to hinder his movements a lot, as long as Sunny was ready to endure a bit of suffering. After a year on the Forgotten Shore, dealing with pain was one of his best trained skills. I've been through worse. Much worse. This is nothing. Then, another thought entered his mind. That shadow fragment, it should have brought me to 1,000, right? A moment later, he realized that his whole being was somehow weird. It felt as though there was intense heat in his chest, slowly growing more and more scalding. This sensation was not exactly physical, but more of a spiritual one. Like the core of his soul was undergoing a violent change. With a mix of anticipation and dread, Sunny concentrated on this feeling. Here we go. What was going to happen to him? Suddenly, he heard the voice of the spell again. In the eerie expanse of the Crimson Spare, where ancient darkness fused with otherworldly light, it sounded solemn and almost triumphant. Your shadow is overflowing with power. Sunny listened tensely, trying to guess what was it going to say next. Your shadow is taking shape. In the next moment, he staggered and fell to his knees. His eyes widened and lost focus. The heat that was building up in Sunny's soul had reached a critical point and then exploded. It felt as though his core was being torn apart, drowning him with intense, indescribable pain. Disoriented and frightened, he tried to scream, but no sound came out of his mouth. Something was emerging from within his soul, ripping it into shreds. Sunny knew that he couldn't stop that process, and so, all he could do was endure. As Sunny convulsed on the ground, the spell whispered, "Your shadow is complete." And then something strange happened. The spell was about to say something else, but then the entire Crimson Spire suddenly shuddered. This quake was much stronger than all the previous ones, making it feel as though the gargantuan structure was about to topple. Sunny heard the deafening sound of breaking stones. Almost at the same time, he was suddenly enveloped in absolute darkness, all light disappearing from the echoing interior of the ancient tower. And the spell abruptly fell quiet, its last proclamation left unsaid. The pain tearing his soul apart was also gone. It didn't feel as though the process was finished, though. It felt as though it was interrupted. What is happening? Confused and disoriented, Sunny looked around. Why was it so dark? Following a premonition, he then raised his head and glanced up. What? The furious light of the Crimson Terror was gone. As Sunny tried to wrap his head around this fact, two things registered in his mind. The first one was that he felt very strange. His chest was still full of ethereal heat, but there was also something else. Some kind of interference? He was having trouble finding words to describe that sensation, but knew that it wasn't harmful. At least, not immediately. The second one was that. Crap. The second thing he noticed was that currently there were giant slabs of stone plunging down on his head. Follow current novels on freewebble.com. Picking himself up from the ground, Sunny dashed to the edge of the wide route and jumped off of it. Just a second later, one of the slabs crushed into the coral, turning it into dust. A violent shockwave hit him in the back. The prowling thorn was currently restoring itself in the Soul Sea, its invisible string cut by Castor's enchanted Jian. So, for a moment, Sunny found himself in free fall. Then, the transparent blur of the dark wing finally weaved itself from sparks of light on his back and allowed him to glide forward, following the momentum of the jump. As he reached the wall of the spire, another deafening crash resounded from behind. Looking up and at the descending mass of broken stone, Sunny thrust the moonlight shard forward. The tip of the fallen memory easily sunk into the ancient granite, giving him purchase. Hanging on it, he pressed himself against the cold stones and gritted his teeth, waiting for the avalanche of debris to pass and praying that nothing hits him. A few moments later, the spire shuddered again, and then grew still. Somewhere down below, Destruction was still reigning on the interior of the spire, but this high, it was relatively quiet. Sunny opened his eyes. He was still alive. The dome of the Crimson Spire seemed to be broken, letting in beautiful sunshine. The darkness was not as impenetrable now, suffused with that light. Dust particles floated in the air, sparkling like tiny diamonds. Sunlight, sunlight? Panicking, Sunny looked around, searching for shelter, but then noticed that his shadow was utterly calm. Unlike before, when his soul was being destroyed by the artificial sun, it wasn't doing anything. It did seem a bit confusing, though. What the hell is going on? Perplexed, Sunny decided to make absolutely sure that the annihilating power of the terror was gone from the rays of sunshine and dove into the soul sea. What he saw there shocked him so much that he almost let go of the hilt of the moonlight shard and fell down. The entire landscape of the tranquil sea was changed. If before there was nothing but darkness, now it was filled with blinding white light. The light flowed through Sunny's soul, making the silent waters ripple and swirl. Up above, the black sphere of the shadow core was burning with furious flames. It trembled and seethed, as though overflowing with power. However, that power was being suppressed by the current of light, which prevented it from spreading outward. Beneath it, there was a massive whirlpool. Stunned, Sunny stared at the unrecognizable expanse of his soul and didn't know how to react. What the hell is this? Full of unease and dark thoughts, he hesitated for a bit and then summoned the runes. Everything was the same as the last time he had glanced at them, except for one line. Shadow fragments, 1000/1000. Not everything. In the cluster of runes describing his attributes, a few new ones appeared. Concentrating on them, Sunny held his breath and read. Attribute, Soul Conduit. Chapter 342, Crimson Terror. Soul Conduit. The attribute had no description, nor was its acquisition announced by the spell. Staring at the runes for a few more seconds, Sunny cast one last glance at the white void of his soul sea and left it. He had no answers for this mysterious sequence of events, but his intuition was ringing the alarm bell. He was almost sure that the strange and painful process that began after he had absorbed the last shadow fragment was somehow interrupted. The white light permeating the soul sea felt unnatural and wrong, like something external to it rather than natural. The mysterious new attribute was most likely connected to this external influence instead of to the saturation of the shadow core. In fact, Soul Conduit was most likely the manifestation of the radiant force that was currently suppressing the core. In that sense, this attribute was more akin to the mind hex of the Soul Devourer than to the Blood Weave. It wasn't something that Sunny had achieved or acquired. It was forced upon him, for reasons yet unknown. Gritting his teeth, Sunny shifted and changed his grip on the handle of the moonlight shard. Then, he summoned the ordinary rock and immediately dismissed it. Finally, he ordered the shadow to wrap itself around his body, then shift to the ghostly stiletto and back. At least the new attribute did not seem to be directly harmful. Sunny was still in control of his body and mind, as well as having full access to his memories and shadow control. All it seemed to be affecting was the shadow core itself, preventing it from achieving whatever it was that had failed to happen. At least for now. But how long would that safety last? Raising his head, Sunny stared at the pinnacle of the Crimson Spire. Something unexplainable had transpired there, causing this strange turn of events. Why was he trying to guess if all the answers were most likely waiting for him up above? To his side, a massive slab of stone had lodged itself between stumps of broken coral roots. More debris piled on top of it at steep angles, forming a twisting path to the distant sunlight. Pushing himself off the wall of the tower, Sunny glided forward and landed on the inclined stone surface. Then, he lingered for a few moments and began climbing up. The higher he ascended, the more sunshine surrounded him. Eventually, the whole tower was filled with nothing but stark beams of light and deep, dark shadows. The world was black and white, as though no other color was allowed into this solemn space. After a while, Sunny approached the broken dome of the Crimson Spire. There, A vast hall was hidden in the darkness, both its floor and roof now shattered, letting in the brightness of the sun. With a deep sigh, Sunny reached with his hands and pulled himself into the hall. He was now at the very pinnacle of the Crimson Spire, in the lair of the terror of the Forgotten Shore. At the very tip of the ancient tower, there was once a vast and beautiful chamber. It seemed as though it had a large circular opening in its center, allowing sunlight to easily flow into the gargantuan structure at high noon. Then, however, that opening had become overgrown by crimson coral, and now it was gone. Due to something that had happened during Changing Star's battle against the Terror, the floor of the chamber partially collapsed, bringing the coral down with it. The ceiling was damaged too, although to a lesser extent. Through the chasm in the spire's roof, Sunny could see the boundless white skies and the burning orb of the artificial sun. Lingering at it for a moment, he then lowered his gaze and looked at the chamber itself. The first thing he saw was Nephise, who was sitting on the floor, staring into the distance. Although her state was not as terrifying as on that terrible night when a dweller of the depths had pulled her beneath the waves of the cursed sea, she did not look too good. The Starlight Legion armor was practically destroyed, revealing gruesome burns and cuts on her ivory skin. Just like then, white flames were seeping out of them instead of blood. These fires seemed strangely weak, though, as though on the verge of being extinguished. They were also failing to mend her mangled flesh. Neff's wounds appeared to be healing, but at a very slow pace, a far cry from the miraculous restoration that Sunny had witnessed so many times in the past. The furious power that had always burned deep within her soul seemed to be finally exhausted. Almost following her gaze, Sunny shuddered when he saw the terror. The creature that had created the Forgotten Shore might have looked as a human once, but now it was like a feverish nightmare. For some reason, Sunny had expected to see the familiar shape of the nameless goddess, whose statue was created in the likeness of the girl that had been made into the vessel of the artificial sun. What met him instead was a giant creature whose body was made out of a perverse fusion of crimson coral and mutilated human flesh. In a sense, it was similar to the crimson golems he had fought at the base of the spire. It was a twisted approximation of a living being, one that radiated a horrifying sense of madness, wrongness, and loss. Instead of a human face, the terror had hundreds of them, all contorted in expressions of blind agony and suffering. Their mouths were open, as though straining to scream. Their eyes were empty wells of pure darkness. At least now they were. When the terror was alive, they must have shone with blinding, annihilating light. And it was unmistakably dead. The harrowing creature was sprawled on the floor, its limbs unmoving, its body fractured almost in half. The edges of the terrible wound were burned and melted, leaving no doubt that it was dealt with by Changing Star's incandescent silver blade. How is this possible? Stunned, Sunny stared at the vanquished terror, failing to comprehend what he saw. How could Neff kill a fallen terror? No matter how powerful she was still a sleeper. Even with the tremendous augmentation of the Dawn Shard, she should not have been capable of slaying something this powerful. Something was very wrong here. This doesn't make sense. But then again, this wouldn't be the first terror Nephise had slain. Changing Star had killed one in her first nightmare, too, earning her that name. Still, there was a vast difference between a dormant human killing an awakened terror and a fallen one. One feat was impossible. The other was simply unthinkable. Turning to her, Sunny hesitated and then said in disbelief, You actually killed it." Neff flinched, as though noticing his presence for the first time. Then, she slowly turned her head and looked at him with empty, lost eyes. Only after a few seconds, a hint of recognition appeared in them. She remained silent for a while, and then said in a hollow voice,
"Sunny.
You are finally here."
Chapter 343 sous le conduit.
He hesitated for a few moments, not sure how to answer. As seconds passed by, the silence between them grew tense, full of untold meaning. Finally, Nephise blinked and looked away, staring at the corpse of the Crimson Terror, her sword hand trembling slightly. "Killed it? Yes, I did. Got lucky, I guess." After a while, she added in a quiet voice. It was just a fake star in the end. Sunny smiled slightly, but his eyes remained cold. Lucky. I know a thing or two about being lucky, Neff. A creature like this would not have died just because of bad luck. She remained silent for a bit, then sighed and looked down. It was evolving, trying to become a titan. The burden of transformation made it vulnerable. I just happened to attack while the terror was at its weakest. That's why it died. Evolving into a titan? Noticing a surprised expression on his face, Changing Star grimaced and pointed to the artificial sun. Have you not thought about what we have done? Sunny looked up at the radiant sphere of light and frowned. In all the chaos, he had indeed forgotten to consider the full scale of what had transpired after the battle, as well as the reasons for and consequences of it. Come to think of it, why would the light of the artificial sun destroy the souls of every living creature it touched? It had not been like this before the fall of the ancient civilization, for many generations at least. But then, the vessel had become corrupted and turned into a nightmare creature, the Terror. And at the same time, the seals imprisoning the curse of the all-consuming darkness had been destroyed, letting it free. So, in fact, the corrupted sun had never existed without the dark sea keeping it company. Until today. Sunny had always thought that the sun was restraining the dark sea. Could it be that it had always been restrained by the darkness as well? And when he banished the ancient curse and locked it underground, the sun was finally liberated from its shackles. That's why its light suddenly changed, turning into the annihilating white radiance. It had become free to do whatever it wanted. But there was something else. As his eyes widened, Nephi nodded.
Yes.
The artificial sun does not just illuminate the vicinity of the Crimson Spire. It illuminates the whole of the Forgotten Shore. Its light reaches everywhere. So, as we were fighting our way through the tower, most of the living creatures on the Forgotten Shore had been wiped out. All that death, all those countless souls, guided into the spire by the labyrinth, like a colossal hecatomb, to fuel the evolution of the Crimson Terror. And Nephi just happened to attack while the Terror was in the throes of that terrifying transformation. Well, that wasn't a coincidence, most likely. Sunny had not forgotten the thoughtful look on her face as Neff had peered out of the gates of the spire before giving the Dreamer army the command to advance. He shivered, only now realizing that this whole region of the Dream Realm was now almost completely empty of life. Only a few nightmare creatures must have survived, those who were lucky enough to hide from the deadly sunlight in time, or were powerful enough to resist it. Such a boundless influx of souls would indeed be enough to push the Crimson Terror to the next step of its evolution. Whatever it was that happened to nightmare creatures as they grew more powerful. Not that Sunny knew anything about this matters, but if anything could cause something like that, then the evisceration of an entire region of the Dream Realm would certainly do the trick. Now, however, the Terror was dead, and its corrupting influence was gone, turning the artificial sun back to its normal self. It couldn't be that easy, though. As if answering his thoughts, the spire shuddered again. Another slab of stone broke off from the floor of the chamber and plunged down. Suddenly, the light of the sun grew a little bit dimmer. Looking up, Sunny noticed that the artificial sun looked not as bright as it had just a few minutes ago. It was as though it was slowly dying. Was it dying? There was no vessel to channel soul essence into its furnace anymore, after all. Interrupting his thoughts, Nephi suddenly spoke, her voice hoarse and tired. What happened to the others? Sunny shifted and looked down through the chasm in the chamber's floor. Far below, he could see the vast balcony and the shimmering ring of the gateway on it. Somehow, its shine seemed weaker. The balcony, however, was empty. There were no humans there, and even the coral golems lay unmoving, their semblance of life snuffed out when the Terror died. Everyone has escaped. Neff sighed slowly, as if with relief. After a long pause, she moved slightly and asked, "What about Castor?" Sunny glanced at her and shrugged. When he spoke, his voice was cold and indifferent. "I killed him." Changing Star remained silent for a long time. Then, she whispered, seemingly addressing no one. "So that's why—" Suddenly, A bitter laugh escaped from her lips. Nephise raised her hands and pressed them against her face, as if overwhelmed by some deep, dark emotion. After a few seconds, her muffled voice reached his ears. "You shouldn't have killed him, Sunny." Sunny snarled. "Yeah? Why exactly?" She remained motionless for a few seconds, and then slowly lowered her hands and put them on her knees. Her face was pale and bleak. "Have you checked your attributes?" He nodded and looked at her with a curious expression. "I did. There's a new one there. Soul Conduit." Changing Star stared into the distance and nodded.
Yeah, same for me.
Sunny raised his eyebrow and asked, his voice calm and steady, "Any idea what it means?" She did not say anything for a while, and then turned her head to look at him. "Have you not figured it out?" He shrugged. "I was a bit preoccupied."
Why?
"What is it?" Nephise sighed and looked at the walls of the chamber. "Finally," she said, "this whole tower is a giant soul machine. It was created to collect soul essence and funnel it into the artificial sun. However, it can't function without one small but crucial gear, a human to serve as the fulcrum of all that power, the conduit for all those souls." And then, in a much quieter voice, she added, "The vessel." Sunny shuddered, then stared at the corpse of the repulsive creature. The previous vessel of the artificial sun. Nephise had killed it, destroying a crucial part of the spire's mechanism, and so, the spire founded a replacement. The two of them, the only two humans left on the forgotten shore, conveniently hiding from the obliterating sun inside the ancient tower. One would be tempted to say that it was fate. What does it mean for us, exactly? Are we going to turn into something like that thing? Neff slowly shook her head. Not yet. Not for a long time. The terror had absorbed most of the souls it had reaped after the battle, and there's no one to make sacrifices to the sun now. The labyrinth, too, is now dead. Echoing her words, the spire trembled once again, and somewhere down below, a deafening sound of crushing stone could be heard. Sunny tilted his head. "So, what's the problem? Can't we just get the hell out of here and never come back?" Changing Star looked at him, her eyes full of cold, bitter emotion. "You don't get it, do you?" After that, she gritted her teeth and said, "The Crimson Spire is a machine, and the Gateway is a part of that machine. The Spire can't function without a human serving as the sole conduit, and neither can the Gateway. There has to be a vessel inside the tower for the Gateway to work." She slowly rose to her feet, swayed slightly, and finally pierced him with a dark gaze. "Which means that only one of us can escape." Sunny stared at her for a few seconds, then looked down at the distant ring of the gateway. Finally, he turned back to Nephise and said, "I don't suppose you'll stay behind and let me go?" Changing Star looked at him, her striking gray eyes full of intensity and nascent white flames. "I was about to ask you the same." Sunny lingered for a moment, then grinned. "Not a chance." Chapter 344 Sorrow, Pain, and Rage. Slowly walking away from the edge of the chasm, Sunny stopped opposite Nephise and looked at her. In his dark eyes, there was nothing but coldness. "Well, it's not like we didn't know for a long time that this would be how things end, did we?" She stared at him for a while, then smiled bitterly. "We did." Indeed, they knew. From that terrible day, when Sunny had first understood the meaning behind Cassie's vision, he suspected that one day, in order to survive, he would have to kill Nephise. This was the truth he had chosen to hide from, even if it meant losing his mind. The final and most unbearable reason why he had spent months alone in the Dark City, hunting monsters and slowly turning into one of them. How does one come to terms with the knowledge that, one day, they will have to kill the person they care for the most? Knowledge, indeed, was the heaviest thing in the world. Back at the beginning of it all, far away from the Dark City, before they had even known that the Crimson Spire existed, Cassie had shared with them a terrible vision. She said, "At first, I saw a boundless darkness locked behind 7 seals. Something vast was churning in the darkness. I felt like if I directly saw it, I would lose my mind. As I watched, terrified, the seals broke one after another, until only one remained. And then that seal broke, too. The first part of her vision described the day when the vessel of the artificial sun had gone mad, and the curse of the all-consuming darkness had escaped the prison created for it by the 7 ancient heroes. I saw the human castle again. Only this time it was at night. There was a lonely star burning in the black skies, and under its light, the castle was suddenly consumed by fire, with rivers of blood flowing down its halls. I saw a corpse in golden armor sitting on a throne, a woman with a bronze spear drowning in a tide of monsters, an archer trying to pierce the falling sky with his arrows. The lonely star shining in the black skies was Nephis, the herald of ruinous change, who had drowned the halls of the bright castle in blood to become its ruler, and then watched as it burned to the ground. The corpse in the golden armor was Gunlog, who had died on his white throne, killed by her hand. The woman with the bronze spear and the desperate archer were Effie and Kai, who had almost perished fighting against the nightmare horde during the siege of the Crimson Spire. In the end, I saw a colossal, terrifying Crimson Spire. At its base, 7 severed heads were guarding 7 locks. And at the top, a dying angel was being consumed by hungry shadows. When I saw the angel bleed, I suddenly felt as though something so precious that it can't be described with words was taken from me. 7 severed heads guarding 7 locks were the heads of the giant statues, who stared at the star sigil that Sunny had used to banish the dark sea. And the last part of the prophecy, it wasn't that hard to understand, too. Nephis was the dying angel, the precious thing that was going to be taken from Cassie, and Sunny was the hungry shadow that consumed her. It was their fate. Then I felt so much sorrow, pain, and rage that what little remained of my sanity seemed to disappear. That was when I woke up, I think. This was the last thing Cassie had said. Looking at Nephis, Sunny sighed and turned away. I warned you, didn't I? I told you that this story won't have a happy ending, that there will be only sorrow, pain, and rage. Do you remember what you answered me? These were the words he said on the day Neff had asked him to join her expedition. Back then, his suspicion that they would inevitably end up as enemies had already grown, becoming almost a certainty. Almost that cursed word. This was the word that had given him hope, no matter how small. Hope that he was wrong. But despite that hope, Sunny had been preparing for this moment for a long, long time. It was because he had known that he would have to face Nephis in combat that he had decided to incorporate Saint's methodical style into his technique, why he trained without rest, day and night, not sparing himself from the pain and hardship. If his only skill was one that she herself had taught him, what chance did he have of defeating her? It was for that reason that he had climbed to the highest point of the hunter's statue and spent a night alone there, steeling himself for the inevitable future, forcing himself to accept the terrible truth that, soon, he would have to kill Nephis. It was because of this that he had refused Changing Star's offer to heal him. How could he allow her to endure the terrible pain of the white flames, knowing that she would be suffering for the sake of her future killer? And it was because of this that he had not tried to learn all of her secret plans, remaining comfortable in his role as a hired mercenary, an outsider. He had known that, no matter what, they would end up here, in this moment, forced to fight each other. Fate was a terrifying enemy to fight against. He knew it better than most. Fate always won, in the end. Defeating it was almost impossible. Shifting slightly, Nephis looked at him and answered, her voice strangely wistful. Life is not a story. It only ends when you die. Sunny smiled. So, are you ready to die? As white sparks ignited in the depths of Changing Star's eyes, she answered with another question. What about you? Instead of answering, Sunny summoned the Midnight Shard and raised it, assuming a battle stance. Opposite of him, Nephis did the same, her silver sword weaving itself from the blinding light. Of course, neither of them planned to kill the other. They needed the other to remain alive, at least until the victor passed through the gateway. How long would the loser survive after that, though? Especially if they were beaten terribly enough to lose the ability to resist further. Staying behind meant death. As the ancient, gargantuan tower quaked around them, balancing on the edge of collapse, lost from light, and Changing Star prepared to cross their blades. Chapter 345 Shadows and Light. Sunny and Nephice looked at each other, the air practically crackling with tension at the point where their gazes met. The white flames seeping from Changing Star's wounds suddenly flashed in a furious outburst, closing some of her wounds and making others seem less severe. After that, however, it grew weak and disappeared, retreating into the furnace of her soul. As a pained grimace contorted the young woman's face, a dim radiance then slowly shined from beneath her ivory skin. At the same time, the shadow flowed up and wrapped itself around Sunny's body, making it brim with power and vitality. He inhaled deeply and slightly moved, shifting his weight from one leg to another. How can it end? Before the thought could fully form, Sunny ruthlessly destroyed it and banished it from his mind. This was the last obstacle on his way back to the real world, and the most deadly. Sunny had fought many terrible creatures in the cursed hell of the Forgotten Shore, but none of them were as fearsome and dangerous as Changing Star. This was going to be his hardest battle yet. To win it, he had to be absolutely clear and absolutely focused. He couldn't allow himself to feel anything or be distracted by anything.
No doubt, no fear.
No regret, no compassion. Only determination. Only resolve. Only murderous will prevail. As dust particles shined in the beams of white light that fell through the broken roof of the ancient chamber, stark shadows swelled with dark anticipation. Nephice brought the pommel of her sword to her shoulder. White flames ignited in her eyes. And then, suddenly, she lunged forward. Fast. But not fast enough to not give Sunny enough time to react. Raising the midnight shard, he dashed forward to block her furious assault and shuddered, the force of the impact sending a shock through his entire body. It felt as though his sword had collided with a mountain. Their blades got entangled for a moment and then separated. Almost immediately, the silver longsword lashed out again, appearing from an unexpected direction, and then again, and again, and again. Sunny feverishly defended, chaining blocks and deflections into one uninterrupted sequence of swift moves. Despite his best efforts, he reeled slightly after each strike. It was as though he was being hit by a hurricane of adamantine sledgehammers, each hit making his bones tremble and groan. How is she that strong? How was Nephice so strong? How was she so fast? How was she so resilient? It didn't make sense. By now, Sunny had fully saturated his core, bringing him to the pinnacle of what a human of his rank could achieve in terms of physical ability. His power was further doubled by the augmentation of the shadow, making him more akin to one of the awakened than to a mere sleeper. No dormant human should have been able to match his power in every regard. And yet, Changing Star did. More than that, she was more powerful than him, tremendously so. She was more like a nightmare creature than a human. Her movements were fast as lightning, her strength was terrifying, and her technique was flawless, leaving him no chance to exploit even the smallest of mistakes. No sleeper should have been that powerful. It was simply impossible. And yet somehow it wasn't. Impossible. Deflecting another blow, Sunny gritted his teeth and dashed to the side, hoping to exploit the momentary opening in his enemy's defense. However, he was met by the ruthless flash of the silver blade instead. The opening was just a ruse, one which almost cost him his hand. Something is very wrong here. Either the augmentation of the white flame was much more powerful than that of his shadow, or something else was at play. However, Sunny didn't think that the radiance emanating from Neph's skin was stronger than his own physical enhancement. From what he had observed during her battle against Gunlock, it was roughly the same or only slightly more forceful. It shouldn't have given her this big of an advantage, especially in its seemingly exhausted state. Somehow, Nephice had grown much stronger between then and now. But how? At least the silver sword was not burning with the annihilating, incandescent light. If it was, the midnight shard might have already been, if not destroyed, then at least severely damaged. In that regard, luck was still on Sunny's side. They exchanged several more blows and disengaged for a fraction of a second, then closed in again. Changing Star's sword shot forward, missing Sunny's face by a few millimeters, or so he thought before sensing warm drops rolling down his cheek. A thin cut appeared on it, swelling with blood. Just a little bit to the right and he would have lost an eye. Shaken, Sunny deflected the sword away, preventing Nephice from slicing his neck with a reverse cut, and leaned forward in an attempt to ram her with his shoulder. Changing Star easily sidestepped around Sunny and brought her weapon down, forcing him to block from a disadvantageous position and stagger back. Curse it! Their violent clash must have looked furious and morbidly beautiful. Both moved with incredible speed and possessed ferocious strength. Both were skilled and experienced, forged into formidable killers by hundreds of deadly battles. One was darkness and shadows, while the other was radiance and light. But the true combat was happening somewhere else, invisible to the naked eye. This fight was as much about strategy and insight as it was about physical prowess and technique. After all, to excel as a fighter, one had to master both their body and mind. Nephice might have been unnaturally fast and strong, but what really made her devastatingly deadly was her own battle genius, her incredible level of understanding of the laws and principles of combat. Armed with it, she was able to predict what her enemy was going to do even before they themselves knew it. But that was not all. The scariest thing about Nephice was that, through that understanding, she was even able to manipulate and dictate her opponent's actions, turning them into her puppet. She was in absolute control of the flow of combat. Combat was her domain, just like shadows were his. But Sunny was not a novice, either. He was a master of manipulation, too. But more importantly, he had enough insight and knew Nephice well enough to, if not deceive her, then at least not allow her to lure him into an inescapable trap. That was why, for a dozen torturously long seconds, neither of them had been able to seriously wound the other. Even if Sunny was locked into desperate defense and outmatched in every regard, he still managed to hold Changing Star's monstrous onslaught off. At least for now. Finally, the two of them disengaged and stepped back, pausing for a few moments. Sunny was breathing heavily, his bloodied face turning even more pale than usual. Nephice stared at him with a grim expression, her own breathing laborious and pained. If this was a cliché drama, at that point, they would have exchanged words, expressing their resolve and determination, admiring their enemy or humiliating them with disparaging insults, showcasing their fearlessness by making a carefree joke. But it was not. Everything that could have been said had been said already. There was no way back. All that remained was violence. Looking at Nephice, Sunny suppressed a devious smile. Something had changed about the proud daughter of the Immortal Flame clan. Something that he had been waiting for from the start of their vicious battle. The wounds that had been partially closed by the white flame were beginning to seep blood again. And as they did, the blood blossom charm hanging on a thread tied around his neck finally rose from its slumber, filling the midnight shard with boundless hunger. Chapter 346 Promise of Blood. Enhanced by the blood blossom, the austere Tachi suddenly felt lighter in his hands, full of cold, frightening determination. It was almost as though it had a mind of its own now, a mind focused on one goal, to find the enemy and get a taste of their blood. Finally, a moment later, Nephice attacked again, her beautiful face cold and indifferent like an alabaster mask. Only the flames in her eyes moved, burning furiously, white as the empty void of the godless heavens above their heads. Sunny gritted his teeth and moved to meet her. Their blades clashed once again. Just like before, he was shaken by the force of the impact, only now, he had managed to intercept her strike a fraction of a second faster. It was as though the midnight shard was ever so slightly pulling his hand, making it move with a bit more speed, aim a little better, and withstand the pressure of the strikes with a subtly less strain. In the next few seconds, that change had become more apparent. Before, he had no chance to launch an offense. Changing Star was reveling in her flowing and unpredictable battle style, her every movement oppressive and unpredictable. This unpredictability alone made him wary of committing to an attack. Of course, Sunny was using the same style. But even though he had mastered it to an admirable degree, his technique was by no means equal to that of Changing Star. What was worse, she knew it far better than him. so his moves could potentially be predicted with terrifying ease. The only reason why Sunny was still on his feet was because of the elements of the Saint's grounded style that he had incorporated into his own. Measured and precise, but also capable of explosive counterattacks, it allowed him to both defend against Neff's ruthless assault and restrain her to a certain degree, using the threat of a sudden reversal to keep her from going all out. More importantly, she was less familiar with that style, which allowed him to diminish the predictability of his movements. And now, with the help of the Blood Blossom, Sunny was able to resist Nephice more efficiently, even if it was just by a tiny amount. But the measure of that difference didn't really matter, because the longer their fight went on and the more she bled, the stronger he would become. It wasn't long before he finally managed to land a hit, the tip of his sword scratching against one of her gauntlets. This is just to begin. However, his thought was instantly interrupted. What? Nephice suddenly changed her behavior. Perhaps she had sensed the shift in the dynamic between the two of them, or perhaps she was just desperate to end this fight before her powers ran dry and her terrible wounds finally caught up with her. Or maybe there was some other reason, one that Sunny failed to account for. But regardless of it, Neff suddenly abandoned her previous calculated attack pattern and instead descended on him in a rain of deadly steel, her defense crumbling and leaving her open to retaliation. Caught by surprise, Sunny barely had time to shift his stance and block. The Midnight Shard was thrown down by a violent blow, pressing against his shoulder. The silver longsword slid across its length and scratched against the guard of the Tachi, mere centimeters away from Sunny's throat. For a few heartbeats, the two of them struggled desperately, trying to overpower the enemy. Their bodies were so close that Sunny could feel Neff's breath on his cheek, as well as the heat radiating from her skin. Damn it! She was just stronger, so much stronger. Little by little, her sword angled forward, and then bit into his skin, blood flowing on its silver blade. With an angry growl, Sunny let go of the hilt of the Midnight Shard with one hand. His fist shot toward Changing Star's body, the ghostly stiletto appearing in it at the last moment. But, of course, Nephice had anticipated that. She twisted her torso, allowing the Moonlight Shard to leave a deep but harmless scratch on her breastplate. In doing so, she had to relieve pressure on the Tachi, allowing Sunny to push her sword away from his neck. But before he could jump back, Neff finished her attack by delivering a devastating blow to his head with the pommel of her sword. Disoriented, Sunny staggered back. He felt blood streaming into his eyes and lost his vision for a moment. Even Shadow Sense was useless, because he simply couldn't differentiate up from down right now. Suddenly, his heart was full of dread. Think. He had maybe a fraction of a second left before suffering a complete defeat. What is she going to do? The silver longsword was currently raised slightly above him after the upward strike. The fastest way to finish the fight would be to bring it down, possibly with its flat on his head, or with its edge on his shoulder, thus severing one of his arms. Yes, the second option was the easiest to execute and the most advantageous, but it was Nephice he was thinking about. What would she do? Faced with the choice of protecting his head or his shoulder, Sunny instinctively threw the Midnight Shard up to block a vertical blow aimed at his skull. His body moved on its own, following the memory of countless hours of training. Thanks to that, he was able to perform the block even in this stunned state. His judgment was correct. The Tachi collided against Changing Star's sword and was thrown aside. But thanks to that, the strike missed his head completely. Instead, it fell on his clavicle and bit deep into his flesh, scraping against bone. Sunny's world exploded with pain. But instead of letting it overpower him, he leaned forward and caught Neff's hand in a trap, entangling it with his own. Then, he drove the Midnight Shard forward and felt it pierce soft flesh. Nephice shrieked, her voice full of agony and shock. Then, she pushed him away. Sunny fell to the ground. Damn, this hurts. Regaining some semblance of control over his mind, he raised a hand and wiped the blood away from his eyes. Then, he rose to his knees and looked in the direction where Nephice had been. She was standing a few meters away, leaning on her sword for support. There was a deep gash in her abdomen, just below the lower edge of the fractured breastplate of the Starlight Legion armor, and a grimace of pain on her face. Blood was flowing from the wound he had caused her like a crimson stream. Their eyes met for a moment, and then Sunny lowered his gaze at the austere Tachi that lay on the floor between them. In all the mayhem, he had lost his sword. Both of them froze for a second. Then, ignoring the terrible pain pulsating in his wounded shoulder, Sunny lunged forward and grabbed the hilt of the Midnight Shard. At the same time, Changing Star rushed forward, raising her sword. However, neither of them got a chance to deliver a strike. Because right at that moment, the Crimson Spire shuddered once again, this time much more terribly than before. And in a deafening thunder of breaking stone, the floor beneath their feet suddenly shattered and collapsed into the darkness, pulling them down with it. Chapter 347 Freefall. Sunny fell down in a rain of broken stone, the floor beneath his feet suddenly crumbling like shattered glass. The Crimson Spire shuddered and moaned, like a giant creature convulsing in the throes of death. The light of the artificial sun grew dim and weak, causing another tremor to run through the ancient tower, wide cracks appearing on its granite walls. Sunny had banished the darkness that devoured the Forgotten Shore every night, and Nephice had killed the vessel of the sun that rose above it every day. Together, they had brought destruction to this cursed land. Today was the end of days for the Forgotten Shore, one that the two of them had ushered in. And one of them was going to have to endure the fallout of this cataclysmic change. Surrounded by a rain of falling shards of stone, Changing Star twisted and somehow managed to aim her sword in Sunny's direction. Even more miraculously, he managed to intercept it with his own. Both were thrown away from each other, the transparent wings weaving themselves behind their backs. For a couple of seconds, Sunny felt his body plunging down into the darkness. Then, finally, the dark wing fully manifested and turned into a blur, supporting his weight. Dodging a massive slab of granite that threatened to crush him, Sunny used it as a step and propelled himself through the air. The Midnight Shard flashed, aiming at Changing Star's wings, but was blocked by the blade of the silver longsword. As the debris fell down, two human figures collided against each other and spun in the air. With nothing to serve as a support, the only chance they had to exert any force was to use the body of the enemy as one. Their bodies entangled, almost as if they were lovers. But in reality, of course, the purpose of this intimate closeness was not love, it was violence. Grabbing Nephice with one hand and using his legs to trap hers, Sunny twisted his torso and delivered a devastating blow to his forehead, feeling the brittle bones of her nose shatter under his strike. But at the same time, her armored fist crashed into his side, aimed cruelly at the half-closed wound left behind by Castor. Sunny screamed. In the next second, her other fist slammed into his face. Augmented by the weight of the silver sword, that blow caused Sunny to lose himself for a short moment. When he came to his senses, the first thing he saw was a massive slab of granite falling on them from above. Feeling blood stream down his face and from the newly opened wound on his side, Sunny bent his knee and then used Neff's body to push himself away. The two of them flew in opposite directions, narrowly avoiding being crushed by the enormous piece of stone. Gliding with the help of their enchanted cloaks, Sunny and Nephice circled around each other, moving down in a wide spiral. Both were too preoccupied with dodging the falling pieces of stone to launch another attack, even if they wished to. Around them, the Crimson Spire was quaking and convulsing, more and more cracks appearing on its walls, whole layers of stone separating from them and plunging down. It felt as though the ancient structure would not be able to hold on for much longer. Above them, the dying sun was growing weaker with each minute. And down below, the runes surrounding the perfect circle of the gateway were shimmering in the darkness, their light slowly becoming unstable. Concentrating at the distant balcony, Sunny hesitated for a moment, then threw a glance at Nephice. Then, he dismissed the dark wing and plunged down, abandoning the safety of flight. Instead, he chose to fall. With air whistling in his ears, Sunny plummeted through the darkness, approaching the vast balcony with terrible speed. Deadly speed. He had to calculate everything perfectly. When the gateway was close enough to discern separate runes shining in a circle around it, he summoned the enchanted cloak again. As the memory began to weave itself into existence, Sunny continued to fall, the stone balcony growing closer and closer. A second later, it was already close enough to see the shapes of the dead coral golems in the darkness. A second more, and a bestial fear took hold of his heart. He was about to die, to splatter on the ground like a crushed bug. Almost at the last moment, the dark wing finally came into existence. Immediately, Sunny activated the enchantment and tried to turn his vertical fall into a horizontal glide. As inertia pulled him down with dreadful speed, he cut a smooth arc in the air and hit the stone surface of the balcony, turning the violent impact into a roll. Then, without losing even a moment, he jumped to his feet and ran toward the gateway. Consumed by pain, Sunny limped over the shimmering runes and entered the ring. Almost immediately, a strange feeling overtook him. It was like that strange and indescribable feeling you get a few seconds before realizing that the reality surrounding you is just a dream and that you are about to wake up. The light of the runes grew stronger. Simultaneously, Sunny's own body began to glow, emanating the same ethereal light. Before that glow had a chance to become bright, though, a shadow fell from above in a deadly rustle of sharp steel. No! Sunny threw his hands up, deflecting the blow of Changing Star's silver sword. Nephice descended upon him like an avenging angel, the fierce white flames burning in her eyes with frightening intensity. As soon as her feet touched the stone inside the iron ring, the shimmering runes blinked and disappeared. Both conduits were cut off from the Crimson Spire, thus breaking the flow of soul energy. Without it, the gateway could not function. Only if one of them was thrown outside would the runes ignite once again. Sunny gritted his teeth and thrust his sword forward, hoping to get Nephice before she had time to regain her balance. But she was too fast, too cunning. Before he could even get close to piercing her flesh, Changing Star was already moving, trapping his blade under her own and throwing it aside. Sunny rammed into her, throwing all of his weight into one devastating blow. At the same time, he felt cold steel brushing against his ribs, causing more blood to stream down. The two of them collided with frightening force and fell out of the iron ring of the gateway, rolling down the steps of the dais. As soon as the first of them crossed the circle of runes, they shimmered and shined once again. Sunny fell on the cold stones and remained lying there, consumed by pain and exhaustion. A low, tortured moan escaped from his lips. Something was broken inside of him. He felt weak and cold. He didn't want to stand up. I'm not done yet. I'm not. Chapter 348 Unbroken. Sunny lay on the ground, gulping air like a dying fish. It felt as though he was drowning. His body was a map of pain. He couldn't even remember how many injuries he had received. There was the gash in his side left by Castor's Jian, the gruesome wound that almost severed his clavicle, the long cut across his ribs, and many smaller ones. But he was still alive. He was still able to fight. He was still not willing to give up. All around him, the Crimson Spire was trembling and groaning, slowly starting to collapse. Gritting his teeth, Sunny tiredly pushed himself off the ground. His body protested, but he forced it into silence and slowly rose to his feet. The blade of the midnight shard scraped against the stones as he pulled it up. Nephice was doing the same. The young woman stood up and staggered, then regained her balance and grew still. Her posture was slumped, with one hand pressed tightly against the deep wound on her abdomen. Changing Star looked weak and beaten, her fearsome presence diminished. Her face was pale, bloodied, and grim, contorted by a grimace of suffering. Only her eyes, which burned with dimming white flames, were still the same, striking, cold, and full of unshakable resolve. Both of them were washed in the ethereal light of the gateway. Looking at Neff through that light, Sunny slowly inhaled and said in a hoarse voice, "Let's finish this." She stared at him for a few moments, then grinned. Her teeth were painted red by blood. In the next moment, Nephice raised her sword and dashed forward, sending a cloud of dust into the air with her feet. They clashed beneath the dais of the gateway, their swords whistling through the air like hungry fiends. The clangor of steel drowned the sound of breaking stone, resounding in the darkness of the Crimson Spire once again. Both Sunny and Nephice were gruesomely wounded, but neither allowed their agony and pain to make them weaker. Instead, they fought with ruthless ferociousness, throwing everything they had left at the enemy, not holding anything back. Now that changing star was bleeding heavily, the blood blossom hanging on Sunny's neck entered a state of frenzy. At times, it felt as though his sword moved on its own, helping him strike faster, harder, with deadlier precision. He had never been as powerful as he was now. And yet, it was not enough. Nephice was still too much for him to handle. She was still too strong, too fast, too overwhelming. She was more like a monster than a human, a demon of silver steel wreathed in pale, white flames. Sunny managed to add several deep cuts to her harrowing collection of injuries, but the damage he received in return was twice as terrible. His left arm was slowly growing numb, weakening his grip on the hilt of the Midnight Shard. His lungs were burning, and it was getting harder and harder to inhale. With each breath, a wet, disturbing sound fell from his lips. His eyes were burning, too, and his vision was becoming blurry because of all the blood streaming into them. He had to rely on Shadow Sense a lot to make up for this debilitating affliction. I can't go on like this. He had to think of something. Something devious and smart, something that would work. But, for the first time, Sunny's bag of tricks was empty. No matter how much he thought, he couldn't imagine anything that would defeat Nephice. She knew him too well. Better than anyone in the entire world. 2 worlds, even. And yet, Sunny felt that he had no chance of victory if everything continued as it had. He was already just one step away from death. And so, he did the one thing he could think of. A desperate gamble with little chance of success. Summoning all of his remaining strength and resilience, he forced his perception to shift and started weaving the strange, taxing movements of the incomplete shadow dance into his technique. He allowed his mind to become formless and shapeless, and then aimed it at Changing Star, trying to mimic her incredible battle art to the smallest detail, and use it as a weapon to destroy her. After all, if not Neph, then who could he ever imitate? He was the person who knew her best in the world. 2. He was her companion, friend, and pupil. He was already practically her shadow, her compliant little helper. Caught in the net of her schemes, in her insane, insatiable desire, and incapable of breaking free, not only because there was no other choice, but also because he didn't really want to be apart from her. He knew her flowing, deadly battle style better than anyone except for Nephice herself. After all, he had practiced it as well, spending countless hours to master its foundation and gain insight into its principles. From repeating the same downward slash hundreds of thousands of times to this terrible battle, he had never stopped learning from her. If he had a chance to make that one final step to mastering the first level of Shadow Dance, it was in a fight against her. And so Sunny fought, summoning the memory of the beautiful slave girl dancing with her 7 shadows. He strained his already failing body to its limit, past the limit, trying to force it to perfectly reflect Changing Star's deadly grace and fearsome elegance. Put under that strain, his body began to collapse. Sunny felt as though there was something brittle in the center of his chest, a small part of his body that was slowly cracking under the pressure. With each move he made, a new crack appeared on its surface. He just hoped that he would make the breakthrough before that small part exploded if he could endure just a little more, do a little more, understand a little more. But in the end, he didn't. After another strange and excruciating move, one that somehow felt different from all the rest, the delicate thing in his chest suddenly shuddered and broke. For a moment, Sunny felt like a marionette whose strings had been cut. His eyes widened in horror. And then, the Midnight Shard shivered slightly. In the next second, the invisible well of power hidden in his soul opened, and a flood of rejuvenating strength carried his exhaustion away. Chapter 349 Fate. When something in Sunny's chest shattered, the hidden enchantment of the Midnight Shard, unbroken, came into effect and opened the floodgates of power to support him in the desperate, defiant last stand. Of course, the blood weave was enhanced by it, too, boosting its restorative powers. The virtuous cycle was complete, simultaneously making him much stronger and bringing him away from death's doorstep. Changing Star's sword whistled through the air, aiming to pierce his flesh, and was thrown aside by the forceful push of the austere Tachi. For the first time since the beginning of their brutal fight, Sunny didn't reel because of the violent shock reverberating through his bones. Now he had reached the absolute pinnacle of his power potential. With his core fully saturated, the shadow wrapped around his body, the blood blossom filling his memories with frenzied might, and the unbroken enchantment of the stalwart blade doing the same for his body, Sunny was as strong as he would ever be before becoming an awakened. Now he was finally able to match Nephi's. Almost. Astoundingly, incredibly, irrationally, she was still stronger.
How?
How, damn it! Sunny moved and fought, blood seeping from his terrible wounds. Although the gap in power between him and Changing Star had diminished significantly, it was still there, making him miss his attacks by a fraction of a second, be too late to block and deflect by a hair's breadth. He was still losing. As the two of them clashed furiously, sparks of burning metal flying into the air from the point where their swords met, the light of the artificial sun had grown dim and unstable, and the crimson spire continued to break apart. At some point, an enormous piece of granite crashed into the vast balcony, showering them with a rain of sharp splinters. A net of cracks appeared on the stone surface beneath their feet, slowly widening as more debris fell down. Both of them were thrown to the ground by the shockwave of the collision, but immediately got up, lunging at each other with dark, murderous determination. Sunny dodged the tip of the silver longsword and thrust his Tachi forward, leaving a deep cut on Neff's forearm, slicing her muscles apart. At the same time, she made a step forward and slammed the pommel of her sword into his mauled clavicle, making Sunny's mind explode with pain. He heard someone scream, their voice hoarse and full of indescribable suffering, then realized a moment later that that bestial voice was his own. Soon, the scream turned into a growl. He wasn't done yet. He refused to be defeated. He refused to give up. He still had a chance to win. Because through all of this, Sunny had continued to push himself toward mastering the first step of the shadow dance. Just before something shattered in his chest, thus causing the Midnight Shard to open the well of hidden power, he had sensed an approaching epiphany. It was already there, at the precipice of his mind. But his body was not strong enough, not malleable enough to manifest it into reality. Or, at least it had not been before receiving the boon of the Unbroken. Now, everything changed. Sunny felt that he would be able to make a breakthrough with the help of the powerful enchantment. Every strike, every block, every step brought him closer to finally being able to complete the foundation of his elusive battle art, to bring his vision of it to fruition. Taking a pained breath, he deflected another vicious attack, hesitated for a split second, and looked away from Nephi's. Instead of watching her body and her movements, he instead gazed at her shadow. The shadow shifted slightly, facing away from the glowing ring of the gateway. Its shadow hands moved, raising a shadow sword. The shadow sword fell, aiming to cut the shadow's enemy down. And suddenly, it felt as though a door opened in his mind. Everything suddenly fell into place. Everything connected. What was fragmented and obscured before now became clear and whole. It was complete. Before Neff's sword could reach him, Sunny evaded it with a slight shift and raised the Midnight Shard. A moment later, he delivered an identical strike, forcing her to retreat. Like that, Changing Star was already attacking again, moving with speed and precision that seemed inhuman. Sunny mirrored her movements, and their blades collided in the air, causing a rain of sparks to fly down. His style changed slightly, growing more graceful. Smooth, flowing.
Deadly.
Just like hers. No, this is wrong. The point of Shadow Dance was not to mirror every movement, to become a literal copy. It was to understand the very essence of the enemy's style and turn it against them. Sunny scowled and changed his grip on the Midnight Shard slightly, then attacked, manifesting the essence of changing stars technique into his own body. Suddenly, he was able to see her intentions with more clarity, understand the pattern of her steps better. He was able to perform every action she had performed, but also those that she had not used yet. After all, he was not a reflection, but a shadow. He wasn't replicating Changing Star's movements. Instead, he was replicating Changing Star herself, the very heart of her battle technique. Neff's eyes widened when she felt the sudden change in his style. When they clashed again, Sunny seemed to be able to mirror her every move, throwing the flow of combat into a violent turmoil. His movements were sharper, faster, filled with more meaningful intent. Her attacks slowed down for a few moments, then grew even more violent and ferocious. Only now, they seemed to be less measured, less controlled. It was as though she had lost her absolute grasp on the cadence of the battle and was now compensating for it with brute strength. Sunny suspected that the small advantage he had gained wasn't going to last long. Nephice was too smart and too gifted to allow this lack of understanding to persist. Soon, she was going to see through the guiding principle of his newly established style and adjust to resist it. Even he couldn't predict what was going to happen then. That is why, despite his best judgment, Sunny gritted his teeth and escalated his attacks, sacrificing any semblance of defense in the process. This had to end fast. At first, he was able to see Neff's intentions with a considerable measure of clarity, allowing him to react to her attacks slightly before she started to move. When possible, he mirrored her strikes to throw the flow of the battle into chaos. His own came with a tiny delay, lagging behind the enemy by a fraction of a second. Then they happened at the same time. And then, miraculously, his attacks started to come in advance of Changing Stars, even if the difference was barely perceptible. That was all Sunny needed. In the terrible crescendo of their merciless duel, blood fell to the cracking stone of the gateway balcony like crimson rain. He dashed forward, turning his torso sideways to let the silver longsword miss his chest and rip through his bicep instead. As a blinding wave of pain flooded his mind, Sunny caught Neff's arm with his own. And then, twisting it, brought his fist on her elbow, shattering it. As pieces of bloodied bone tore through her skin, Nephice shrieked terribly and made an awkward move, trying to smash him in the head with the flat of her sword. But because it was now only held in one hand, the force and speed of that strike were not as formidable as that of her previous attacks. Diving under the blade of the silver longsword, Sunny fell to one knee and pushed the midnight shard forward in a horizontal cut, its blade tearing through Neff's abdomen and exiting in a flood of blood from her back. Pulled by the inertia of her attack, Nephice made a step forward and came to a sudden stop. As the sword slid from her grip and clattered to the cold stones, she swayed a little, and then fell heavily to the ground. The radiance of her skin was slowly fading away. With his back to her, Sunny stared into the darkness. After a few moments, he closed his eyes and sighed. Over. A second or two later, he stood up, turned around, and walked toward the broken figure of the young woman, who was still trying to reach for her sword, blood spilling from her mouth. As Sunny's shadow fell on Nephice, she gritted her teeth and spat. It's not over yet. I can. Ruthlessly throwing the silver longword away with the tip of his boot, Sunny looked at her from above and said in a tired, listless voice, "You can't. It's over, Neff." Then, he looked away at the shining dais of the gateway. His face was hidden in the shadows. "You're done."
He won.
Looking at the shining gateway, Sunny tasted that word. Why was it so bitter? Why was it so painful? Why wasn't it sweet and joyous? With a dark grimace, he glanced at Nephice, and then turned away. What could he say to her that had any meaning? One of them was going to escape this hell, and the other was going to stay. One was victorious, and the other was defeated. One of them was going to live, and the other was going to die. Any words he could find would be empty, but not empty enough to express the hollow sense in his heart. His feet trembled as he made the first step toward the gateway. To hell with this. Why did his heart have to feel so heavy? Why wasn't he celebrating? He deserved to be saved. He struggled and suffered to get to come this far, enduring countless horrors that would have broken and destroyed anyone else. He bled and fought, clawing his way to this point, never allowing himself to rest or stop growing.
He
Was the strongest. He was the last one left standing. Not the countless nightmare creatures of the Forgotten Shore. Not Haruz, that damned hunchback. Not Gunlog, the mighty bright lord. Not Castor, the strongest even among other legacies. Not even Changing Star, the last daughter of the legendary Immortal Flace clan. No, it was him. A homeless kid from the outskirts with no place to call his own. Someone whom no one had ever expected to survive, let alone thrive in the ruthless embrace of the nightmare spell. Whom everyone considered to be below them, an inconsequential nobody with no chance of ever becoming anything else. Well, he showed them all, had he not? Gritting his teeth in anger, Sunny made another step. To hell with you. Behind him, Nephise had finally abandoned her hopeless attempts to reach her sword. As Sunny walked away, she slowly crawled a few steps, then arduously pushed herself and sat up, leaning on a piece of rubble. The light of the gateway reflected in her eyes as she watched him go, hunched, seemingly unable to move anymore. Stepping over a wide crack in the stone that was slowly approaching the shimmering circle of runes, Sunny came to the iron ring. Now, only one step separated him from freedom. But instead of making it, he suddenly froze, looking into the distance with a grim expression on his face. A second passed by, then another. The crimson spire shuddered once again, sending more stone falling down. As the light of the artificial sun grew so dim that it was almost impossible to see, Sunny swayed a little, then turned around and walked back to Memphis. Stopping above her, he lingered for a moment, then kneeled, so that their faces were on the same level. Looking Neff right in the eyes, Sunny raised his hands and clapped several times. Finally, he said in a terrible, furious voice, "Congratulations. You almost fooled me." Chapter 350 End of the Nightmare. Nephise stared at him tiredly, straining to understand his words. The radiance was gone from beneath her skin, and instead of it, white flames had once again appeared, licking weakly at her wounds. However, their power was almost gone. Instead of healing, all they could do now was stem the bleeding and prevent Changing Star from dying right there and then. A few seconds later, she opened her mouth, letting blood flow over her lips, and said in a low, barely audible voice, "What are you talking about?" Sunny snarled. "Drop the act. Your performance was, indeed, masterful. But don't forget who taught you how to lie in the first place. Did you really think that you would be able to deceive me?" She was silent for a few moments, then whispered, "I don't understand." He looked at her and asked, his voice shaking with anger, "Why did you do it? Why?" Nephise blinked and drew in a shaky breath, but didn't say anything, looking at him with pain and confusion. Realizing that she wasn't going to answer, Sunny spat. "Why did you throw the fight?" She lingered for a moment, then said quietly, "I didn't." A bitter smile appeared on Sunny's lips. Shaking his head, he said, "You almost made it work, you know. I almost bought it, but after all of it was done, and I could think clearly, some things really didn't add up. They didn't make any sense. No matter how I looked at it, something felt wrong." The spire swayed, drowning their voices in the sound of breaking stone. Not paying it any attention, Sunny continued. "First, I know for a fact that you are somehow able to support two augmentations at the same time. You did so while fighting Gunlog. One to enhance your sword, the other to enhance your body. I rarely forget things, so how could I not remember this? Once you were heavily injured, you summoned back the flames from the sword and were able to simultaneously strengthen yourself and heal those wounds. And yet, you only used one when fighting me. Funny, isn't it?" Nephise stared at him, not saying anything. Then she uttered, "My powers were exhausted." Sunny spat. "I would have believed that, maybe, if not for your other mistakes. Back at the top of the spire, you had an opportunity to cut off my arm, ending the fight right there and then. That was the best course of action, the swiftest and most effective attack you could have performed. But instead, you chose a less advantageous method and went for my head, striking with the flat of the blade." A grim expression appeared on his face. Someone else might have made that choice, but not you. Not Changing Star, the Sword Saint. The only reason for you to pass on that golden opportunity is that you never really wanted to win.
Didn't you?
He looked up and grimaced, pain assaulting his mind like a furious sea. And finally, why did you even stay there at the top of the tower, waiting for me to come? If you wanted to escape, you could have gone to the gateway as soon as you realized what the soul conduit was, not even giving me a chance to save myself. But you did not. You just sat there quietly and waited, ignoring your chance to reach the gateway first. So why? He looked at her and shouted, the pain finally finding its way into his voice. Why the hell did you pretend to go all out on me while planning to lose from the start? Nephi stared at him for a while, her face pale and inexorable. Then, she sighed and looked away. After a moment, she said quietly, maybe it is because I am far away from home, too. Sunny stared at her for a couple of moments, then snarled.
What?
What the hell is that supposed to mean? Changing Star turned her head and looked at him calmly, then smiled. All right, Sunny.
You caught me.
Now go. This tower won't last much longer. As she said that, the white flames flowing from her wounds suddenly flashed, growing stronger and brighter. Her injuries started to heal once again, not as fast as in the past, but still with considerable speed. Her eyes shined with fearsome radiance. He gritted his teeth. Like hell I will. Not before you give me an answer. Nephi shrugged tiredly, then looked him in the eyes. What it is that you want to know? Sunny clenched his fists. Why even fight me if you wanted to let me win all along? She sighed. As he stared at her with burning intensity, Neff said, isn't it obvious? Because if I didn't, you wouldn't go. Turning away, she lingered for a moment, and then continued. People are usually either cruel or kind.
But not you.
You can be both, depending on the situation. Either ruthless or compassionate. Either cruel or kind. So that's what I did. I created a situation that would allow you to be ruthless and cruel. To leave me behind without showing any mercy. Sunny stared at her, his fists trembling. But why? Why would you doom yourself to save me? What happened to your goddamned goal? Didn't you tell me that you will sacrifice anything, anyone, to achieve it? Nephi looked at him and smiled bitterly.
Why?
Are you the only one who is allowed to grow and change? Can I change too, Sunny? She turned away and said tiredly, her voice full of invisible but crushing weight.
Yes, I did say such a thing.
But saying and doing are two different things, Sunny. Once it all started, once all those people were dying because of what I had done, once I suffered defeat after defeat, it was more difficult than I could ever imagine. It was distasteful. He shook his head in shock. So, that's it? You just gave up? After all that crap, you just decided that it was too much for you? Changing Star remained quiet for a bit, then slowly shook her head. You don't really understand me at all, do you, Sunny? Facing him, she grinned. Give up? No, I didn't give up. I didn't abandon my goal. I just realized that I was not ambitious enough. As white flames grew brighter in her eyes, Nephi said, I am going to destroy the spell and all those who stand in my way. I will accomplish everything that I want, but I will also do it in the way that I want. I will do it in a way that suits my desire, without compromising anything, without sacrificing my sense of right and wrong. Illuminated by white radiance, her pale, bloodied face seemed like a face of a demon. Manipulating all those people, causing their deaths? I would do it again. I would kill more if I needed to, because it was fair and right. I gave them the chance to save themselves, or die fighting against the spell. There is no better way. For a moment, her eyes were aflame with passion. However, then her expression suddenly changed. Looking down, Nephi added in a quiet voice, but abandoning you here would be vile and wrong. It would leave a bad taste in my mouth, just like leaving a helpless blind girl to die alone would. I won't do it. If I do, I would be no better than those who I want to destroy. What's the point of reaching my goal if, in the process, I become the same as those whom I hate? She pierced him with a burning gaze and said,
No, Sunny.
My goal hasn't changed. It's just that reaching by using a wrong path is worse than not reaching it at all. But why do you care anyway? Don't you think that it is insane? Don't you think that I am despicable and vile? So go. Why are you hesitating? Sunny stared at her, a deep frown appearing on his face. Finally, he asked, I'm hesitating because of you, fool. What about you? Nephi smiled.
What about me?
Do you think I will die here in this tower?
No.
I will be fine. I will escape it and survive somehow. I'll find another way out. No matter how long it's going to take me, I will. Nothing will stop me. You know it won't. He stared at her for a while, then glanced at the shimmering gateway. The crack traveling through the stone balcony was already almost upon the circle of runes, threatening to destroy them. Salvation was so close. He could almost taste it. Turning away from the dais, Sunny shook his head. That is a horrible plan. You want to travel around the dream realm battling nightmare creatures? Fine. Let's do it together. We can try to go through the Hollow Mountains and reach the human citadels on the other side. And that's just the south. We can also try north, east, and west, searching for an unclaimed gateway. Two of us will have a better chance to survive. The two of us, together it's better than being alone. Right? She hesitated for a long time, then closed her eyes and slowly shook her head. When she spoke, her voice was wistful and tired.
No.
I can't let you stay, Sunny.
Go.
Go and meet your sister. There's something waiting for you in the real world, at least. All that's waiting for me is emptiness, bloodshed, and graves. If I return, the same thing that happened in the bright castle will repeat itself, over and over again, until there's nothing else. So go while you can. The runes of the gateway shimmered, as if on the verge of disappearing. He gritted his teeth.
No.
Nephise opened her eyes and looked at him, a sense of sorrow appearing on her face. Leave me, Sunny.
Please.
Go. He shook his head stubbornly. I don't want to. Changing Star was silent for a moment, looking at him with a pained expression. And then she said, making his world crumble. Go. Lost from light. His eyes widened. Deep within his soul, something moved and rose from slumber, triumphant. Unbreakable, eternal, irresistible, complete, perfect, and sweet. Before Sunny knew what he was doing, his hand shot forward, the ghostly blade of the moonlight shard appearing in it. Stop. His hand froze, the tip of the stiletto mere centimeters away from Neff's eye. Trembling, he looked at his arm and willed it to move forward. But it didn't. It didn't move at all. It was as though that hand did not belong to him anymore. As deep horror drowned his heart, Sunny moved his gaze and looked at Nephise, his eyes wide with shock. How? A sad smile appeared on her lips. How did I know? Cassie told me. Neff sighed and looked away. She was the first one to understand the meaning of her vision. She knew that the two of us will end up fighting each other, and that I was going to lose.
Maybe A and D.
She just didn't know how, when, and why. So, Cassie told me your secret, in hopes that it will save my life one day. But I hoped that I would never have to use it. Sunny stared at her, too shocked to say anything. She smiled sadly.
So, then.
I guess this is goodbye. I hope that you'll take care of yourself, Sunny.
Now go.
Escape before it is too late. Even though Sunny didn't do anything, his body moved on its own. Standing up, he turned around and walked toward the shining ring of the gateway. Step, step. Another step. Stop, stop. But his body would not listen. It just continued to move forward, indifferent to his commands. A dull ache settled somewhere in the center of his heart. Stop. There was nothing he could do. He was a miraculous shadow bound to a master. Once the master gave a command, he had no choice but to obey. Sunny slowly walked up the steps of the dais and approached the circle of runes, then crossed the iron ring without slowing down. As soon as he did, the runes shone with intense light. His body began to glow, too.
No.
I refuse. The ethereal radiance grew brighter and brighter until it became hard to discern the human figure in its middle. No. And then, suddenly, it disappeared, leaving only emptiness behind. Sunny was gone, finally free of this long and arduous nightmare. The journey back to reality that had taken him more than a year was now over.
He made it out alive.
Just a few seconds after he disappeared in a flash of light, the crack in the stone reached the circle of runes and broke it. The shine of the gateway grew unstable and swiftly faded away. At the same time, the artificial sun of the Forgotten Shore ignited one last time with a bright, intense explosion of light, and then extinguished. Left alone in the collapsing tower, and with no more light to shine upon her, the beaten, broken figure of Changing Star disappeared into the shadows. End of Volume 2. Demon of Change. Chapter 351. Once again, Sunny found himself in the endless space between dream of reality. All around him, there was nothing but a boundless black void, which was illuminated by a myriad of bright stars. Between those stars, countless strings of silver light were woven into a beautiful and inconceivably complex pattern. Once again, he felt as though he had glimpsed the inner workings of the spell. Was it just an illusion, or was he able to see more now? It was almost as if his eyes were now able to discern a hint of meaning behind the unimaginable, titanic brilliance of the ethereal weave. He had the eyes of Weaver now, after all. With a pained moan, Sunny forced himself to look away from the strings of silver light. The magnitude of the secret hidden in this cosmic pattern was so immense that just thinking about it could drive him mad. The Forgotten Shore had taught him an important lesson, and it was that one had to be careful about what they looked upon. Some things were not meant to be seen by humans. Not to mention that he had other things to think about. Curse it. Curse it all.
Curse all of you.
His voice disappeared into the darkness, full of indescribable fury, bitterness, and sorrow. No one was there to hear it, except for the spell, which chose to tactfully remain silent. Breathing heavily, Sunny clenched his fists and closed his eyes. He didn't know what brought him more rage and pain, the fact that he had lost Neff, or the fact that his secret had been revealed. Both were too bitter to swallow. All that time, all that suffering, and for what? He had outsmarted and defeated so many powerful enemies, only for his true name to be discovered by an ungrateful, weak, blind girl. After everything he had done for her, Cassie's betrayal, perhaps, had hurt him the most. Curse her. Once again, he was a slave. He made a full circle and returned exactly to where he had started, in shackles. Only instead of nameless slavers, Nephites had become his master now. Nephites. Sunny gritted his teeth and groaned, a storm of conflicting emotions tearing his heart apart. Why did she have to do it? Why? The pain of losing her, the hope of finding her again, was just as strong and overwhelming as the hope that she would die and disappear forever in the unforgiving hell of the dream realm, so that they would never have to meet again. So that he would be free. He clawed at his face, not knowing how to process this conflagration of feelings. For someone who had spent most of his life alone, not caring for anything, this was all just too much. Luckily, time in this boundless void was a strange concept, so he had an eternity to try and come to terms with his new reality. The spell kept silent, as though giving him a chance to do just that. After a while, maybe hours, or maybe days, or maybe just a single second, Sunny sighed. Some time later, he opened his mouth and whispered, "I won." He had survived. Who could have thought? Slightly more than a year ago, he was thrown into a region of the dream realm that no human had ever escaped, and now he was not only returning to reality, but also doing so as one of the most powerful sleepers in the history of the human race. Maybe even the strongest one, or the second strongest. He had survived countless horrors, crossed a cursed sea on a boat made of demon bones, slew hundreds of nightmare creatures, gained experience and scars worthy of a lifetime, touched the hidden knowledge of the gods, saw a tyrant die and a new one be crowned, banished an ancient curse into the darkness of oblivion, and watched as a son died. And now, he was about to become an awakened, an elite among elites, a person at the very top of society, one with access to the best food, the most wealth, the highest forms of prestige. the highest everything. All his dreams were going to come true. All his suffering would now be rewarded. I will not be sad. I will not be bitter. I will not be angry. Who should I? Had he gone through this nightmare to be left heartbroken on the other side?
No.
He had earned this joy, this delight, this triumph, and he was going to enjoy it. Slowly, a shaky smile appeared on Sunny's face. At first, he had to force himself, but after a while, the smile became sincere. That's right. Victory is supposed to be sweet. So, let's see, what should I start with? As if answering him, the spell finally spoke. Its voice sounded a little strange, as if it was continuing a sentence after being interrupted. Your shadow is overflowing with power. Your shadow is taking shape. Suddenly, Sunny felt his soul begin to radiate a strange heat once again. Crap. Your shadow is complete. Something inside of him exploded, drowning his whole being with indescribable suffering. With a startled yelp, Sunny fell down. How come I end up on my ass every time I come to this place? The first time Sunny had appeared in the void, he was so shocked to discover the divine rank of his aspect that his legs buckled. And now, due to the painful transformation happening to his soul, he ended up in the same situation again. Because he had left the Crimson Spire, this soul conduit attribute was gone. And without its interference, the strange process that had begun due to the saturation of the shadow core was finally able to continue. It was just as painful as Sunny remembered. Gritting his teeth to prevent himself from screaming, Sunny tried to endure that terrible agony. He was no stranger to physical pain, but this was something different. It came from the soul itself, and for that reason, was so much worse. Arg, damn it all. However, it was still not nearly as bad as the chilling torture he had gone through after consuming the drop of Weaver's blood, or the nightmare he had endured after meeting the Black Knight for the first time. And it didn't last as long. After a while, the pain lessened, and then finally disappeared, leaving him feeling refreshed and whole again. Sunny carefully stood up and looked down, checking to see if he was still in one piece. He felt stronger. Much, much stronger. Stronger, faster, more resilient. Very much so. He felt so powerful, in fact, that for a moment Sunny even entertained the idea that he had subconsciously commanded his shadow to wrap itself around his body and was now enjoying the effect of its augmentation. To make sure that this wasn't the case, he habitually glanced down to check on the shadow, and froze. What the hell? The shadow was not wrapped around his body. It was where it was supposed to be, on the unseen surface Sunny was standing on, somehow visible despite the darkness of the black void. But it wasn't alone. Two identical shadows were currently staring back at Sunny. One seemed sulking and morose, and the other appeared to be joyful and friendly. Chapter 352 Monster Core. Sunny stared at the two shadows, dumbfounded. After a while, he said in an uncertain tone, Am I seeing things, or are there two of you? The shadows, of course, did not answer. They had no vocal cords after all. However, the sulking one looked at him with contempt and shook its head in derision. The friendly one, meanwhile, looked down shyly and slightly shrugged. What is going on? Frowning, Sunny lingered for some time and then dove into the soul sea. With the soul conduit attribute gone, it was back to its usual, tenebrous appearance. The surface of the water was tranquil and still, and hundreds of motionless shadows stood silently in the darkness. Above him, shining spheres containing the memories were circling around the... Sunny raised his head, then flinched. Where the black sun of the shadow core had once loomed above the quiet sea, there were now two. Two identical shadow cores hovered in the dark sky, shining with lightless black radiance. He blinked. There's two of them. A few minutes passed, or at least something that felt like a few minutes. There's two. I have two cores. Why do I have two cores? Humans only ever had one soul core. That was a fact. Only nightmare creatures had more. Sunny looked down at his hands, then made them into fists, feeling newly gained strength course through his muscles. Then he scowled and looked up again. Your shadow is taking shape. Your shadow is complete. So the spell was not speaking about the bad-tempered shadow that had accompanied him for so long. Initially, Sunny had assumed that the shadow and his core were going through a transformation due to the acquisition of the 1000th fragment, perhaps evolving or even awakening. But the spell actually meant to say that his second shadow, and thus a second shadow core, were complete. They had been assembled from the 1000 shadow fragments he had collected, making him a what? Sunny hesitated for a bit, then ordered the shadows to wrap themselves around his body. The sulking one seemingly rolled its eyes before obeying the command. The friendly one seemed extremely delighted to do as he asked. Both flowed up and covered his body. Immediately, Sunny felt his already considerable strength double, and then triple. His mouth hung open. Too powerful. This is too powerful. This was incredible. To experiment further, he commanded one of the shadows to return to the surface of the tranquil water. A moment later, he had a shadow once again, but still enjoyed the familiar augmentation, even if it grew weaker, returning to its previous strength. He then summoned the Midnight Shard and ordered the second shadow to wrap itself around its blade. Now both his body and his sword were augmented. Then, he sent the sulking shadow to join the friendly one. His body was not enhanced anymore, but the austere Tachi felt much sharper, more lethal, more deadly. Finally, he commanded one shadow to leave the Midnight Shard and cover the puppeteer's shroud. Two memories were augmented at the same time. Holy hell, this was just too good. Sunny stood silently for a while, staring into the distance. So this was it. This was the most unique, most powerful side of his aspect. A divine aspect, after all, was not necessarily more powerful than a lesser one, but it had much more potential. With a second core and a second shadow, the gap between Sunny and the other awakened was going to increase. And if he was right about it, if he was right, this was only the beginning. Because if there was a second core, there would most likely be the third one, and then the fourth. Suddenly, it all made sense. Why Nephice never seemed to be able to saturate her soul core, no matter how many shards she absorbed, no matter how many nightmare creatures and humans she slew. Why she had been incapacitated after killing Gunlog. Why she was so much stronger, faster, and more powerful than him, even at his peak. It was because her aspect was divine, just like his. But she had discovered its secret much sooner than him. As a dull pain appeared in his heart, Sunny banished the image of Changing Star from his mind and summoned the runes. He had to make sure that his guess was right. Name: Sunless. True name: Lost from Light. Rank: Dreamer. Below that, new runes were shimmering in the darkness. Sunny's eyes widened. Class: Monster. Shadow Cores. 2-7. He stared at the glowing runes, his face calm, his heart engulfed by a dark fire.
Monster.
2 out of 7. He was right after all. His progression path was indeed different from all of humanity. It was harder, larger, but also so much more promising. The promise of it was as vast as it was frightening. He was reluctant to even try to imagine the pinnacle of what he would potentially be able to achieve. The possibilities were simply limitless. What would a human with 7 cores and the might of a titan be capable of? What obstacles would they be unable to conquer? Who would dare to stand in their way? Who would dare to call them their slave? Of course, the road to creating 5 more cores would be long and arduous. It would take him years, if not decades, if he even manages to live that long. In fact, the magnitude and scale of such an ambition were nothing short of insane. After all, the stronger he grows, the stronger enemies he would have to face to collect their shadow fragments. It seemed all but impossible. Almost. Was he really going to try? After some time, Sunny lowered his gaze and continued to read the runes. His face looked like that of a madman. There was simultaneously a deep frown and a wide smile somehow coexisting on it, making for a strange sight. But then, the wide smile disappeared, leaving only the frown behind. There was something even more important waiting for him in the glow of ethereal runes. Something even more frightening. Reaching the lowest part of the field of runes, he read. Aspect: Shadow Slave. Aspect rank: Divine. Aspect description: You are a miraculous shadow left behind by a dead god. As a divine shadow, you possess plenty of strange and wondrous powers. However, your existence is empty and lonesome. You mourn the passing of your former master and long to find a new one. Right beneath it was the description of the part of the aspect that had cursed his life, turning it into a nightmare. Innate ability: Shadow Bond. Ability description: find a worthy master and let them know your true name. Once they recite it out loud, you will be bound to their will, unable to disobey any command. It is improper for a shadow, let alone a divine one, to walk around without a master. However, the runes describing Shadow Bond were gray and lifeless, as though the ability was now inactive. Makes sense. He had a master now, after all. He wasn't free to walk around without one anymore. And speaking of it, right below, new runes were now shining in the darkness. Master, Changing Star. Sunny stared at those 3 words for a long time. Who knew that just 3 words could bear such a crushing weight? Such a vast and complicated meaning. Finally, he shook his head slightly and concentrated, making the runes shine brighter, new ones appearing out of nowhere as he watched. Name: Nephice. True name: Changing Star. Rank: Dreamer. Class: Demon. Chapter 353. Lightbringer. This chapter is updated by Novelist.pl. The runes shimmered in the tranquil darkness of the silent sea. Name: Nephice. True name: Changing Star. Just as Sunny had suspected, that true name hid many meanings. It didn't describe a star that was always changing, but instead a star that caused change. However, there were a lot of words for change in the runic language, each hiding a unique meaning. The one used here meant a cataclysmic change that brought ruin and disaster, sometimes bad and sometimes good, but always cruel and calamitous, wreathed in misfortune. So, in a sense, Nephice was neither a star of change nor a star of ruin, but both. The two went hand in hand, inseparable, destined to bring both salvation and damnation to those touched by her light. Just like what had happened to the doomed dreamers of the Dark City. The spell was really good at giving names, it seemed. Thinking of his own true name somberly, Sunny read further. Rank: Dreamer. Class: Demon. Soul cores: 3 out of 7. Soul fragments: 2749/3000. He stared at the last 2 strings, a dark expression written on his face. So this is how far ahead of me you are. Then, with a heavy sigh, he looked away. Many events of the past few months made sense now. During the fight against Gunlog, Nephice had already been a dormant monster, just like he was right now, a dreamer in possession of 2 cores. It was because she had known that killing the Bright Lord would push her toward the 3rd that she asked him to prevent Castor from attacking her in that moment of weakness. And in the time since, Changing Star had almost reached the 4th. How was she so fast? Sunny had made a conscious choice to avoid saturating his core during the Civil War in the Bright Castle. In hindsight, this decision had turned out to be a wrong one, or maybe not. If he had collected all 1,000 shadow fragments back then, he might have been dead already, killed by one of Tessai's guards or a nightmare creature while completely incapacitated by the formation of the 2nd shadow core. Hell, he would have been crushed to death by a piece of falling granite if not for this soul conduit suppressing the process at the best possible moment. Just as always, terrible misfortune had come together with incredible luck. But even if he had come to possess the monster core back then, he would have never managed to create a 3rd, let alone get this close to the 4th one. It was because Nephice had one big advantage over him in the matter of collecting essence. Like every awakened except for Sunny, she received a certain portion of the enemy's accumulated soul essence when killing a fellow human, while he received only a single shadow fragment, or a few, at best, if the enemy was of the higher rank than him. Which hadn't happened yet, but was inevitably going to, considering his luck. The war against Tessai and Gemma must have been a true feast for Changing Star, especially when slaying those experienced members of the host that had long saturated their cores themselves. She was always on the front line, after all. Fighting, killing, leading her followers. Sunny grimly stared into the darkness for a while, then slowly turned back to the runes. His eyes slid lower. Memories. Dreamblade, Starlight Legion Armor, Dawn Shard, Darkwing, Nameless Sun. There were a few utility memories too, including Evertwine, the golden rope he knew so well. But Sunny did not pay them a lot of attention. His sight was attracted to the Nameless Sun. What was that memory, and why hadn't he seen or heard of it before? Memory. Nameless Sun. Memory rank. Ascended. Memory tier 6. Memory type. Weapon. Memory description. For a long time, the Nameless Sun suffered in solitude, longing for all the things that were lost. Only when she lost that longing, too, was the crimson terror of the Forgotten Shore finally born. His eyes narrowed. So, she received a memory after killing the vessel, after all. An ascended weapon of the 6th tier. Sunny wished that he could see its weave and learn what enchantments that terrible memory held. Whatever they were, however, the Nameless Sun was bound to be extremely powerful. But was it enough to help Nephi survive in the ruthless hellscape of the Dream Realm?
He did not know.
Frowning, Sunny continued to read the runes. Echoes. Attributes. Dreamspawn, Nephilim, Flame of Divinity, the Fire. Dreamspawn attribute description. You are born of 2 worlds, belonging to both, but welcomed in neither. Your soul exists on the edge between nightmare and reality. Nephilim attribute description. There once were terrible creatures born of an unholy union between the divine and the profane. Nephilim were the most beautiful and the most harrowing of them all. Flame of Divinity attribute description. Your soul is a flame with the light of divinity. The Fire attribute description. You have inherited the lineage of Sun God. He hesitated for a bit, studying Neph's attributes. So that's how it is. Sunny had always wondered what was her innate attribute, the one that was at the center of all the rest, the core of her being, just like his fated trait. He often thought that it was tied to drive, battle prowess, or will. But it was not. Instead, Neph's innate attribute was called Dreamspawn and tied to her nature as a child of a hollow mother. In a sense, she was connected to the dream realm and the nightmare spell from before she had even been born. Her core trait was duality. If his guess was correct, that duality was further expressed after Nephis had conquered her first nightmare and received her aspect, as well as a new attribute, Nephilim. Once again, it described a half-blood creature, half divine, half profane, half deific, half unknown. Suddenly, he remembered how Changing Star had stopped and stared at the depiction of a radiant being engraved into the walls of the ancient mine below the Hollow Mountains. Was that creature one of the Nephilim? Or a fallen angel, from whom Nephilim were supposed to be born? After all, the similarity between that creature and her own powers was hard to deny. And then there was the last attribute, the Fire. Sunny rubbed his face. A lineage attribute, somewhat similar to his own blood weave. Finally, the meaning behind that word became clear. Lineage memories akin to the drop of ichor were able to impart awakened with unique attributes that, unlike the usual ones, seemed to be hereditary. They could be passed down through a bloodline, and at least one of the great legacy clans, the almost destroyed Immortal Flame, possessed one. Did all great legacy clans, like Song or Valor, possessed one, too? Was that what allowed them to rise to the very top of humanity and claim their place as great clans, in the first place? Those bastards have so many secrets. Sunny also couldn't help but notice a slight difference between Bloodweave and the Fire. While the latter was described simply as lineage, the former was described as a forbidden lineage.
What exactly made Bloodweave forbidden?
Was it because it didn't come from a proper deity like Sun God, but from a mysterious weaver who was a demon? Had no one except for gods been allowed to leave behind a lineage? The Bloodweave was also described as a partial lineage, while the Fire was not. Questions. With a sigh, Sunny turned to the runes once again. Aspect. Lightbringer. Aspect rank. Divine. Aspect description. You are a creature of light that was banished and doomed to exist in the darkness. You bring radiance and warmth to wherever you go, but with it comes indescribable longing. Aspect ability. Soul flame. Ability description. Your soul burns with the purest of flames. That flame can both restore and destroy, and is both a blessing and a curse. Innate ability, half-breed. Ability descriptions. You can directly absorb a portion of the soul essence of any nightmare creature destroyed by your flames, as well as of any human.
Flow, pristine soul.
Flaw description. You must suffer to use your power. Sunny dismissed the runes and was motionless for a while, thinking. The name of the aspect, Lightbringer, could be translated in several ways. The first rune could mean both light and fire, and the second meant either to bring or to bear, depending on context. So, it could have been Firebearer as well, not that it made any difference. The rest he had already known or suspected, so it didn't surprise him much. Only the strange innate ability, Half-breed, was somewhat new. Nephice had mentioned once that she was capable of doing something like that, but without sharing any details. It was also funny that the name of her flaw was Pristine Soul, while his was Clear Conscience. What a pair they were, one lost from light, the other the source of it. One a master, the other a slave. He gritted his teeth and closed his eyes for a second. What else was there to note? The soul conduit attribute was gone. It seemed that the artificial sun, or the Crimson Spire itself, had sustained too much damage and collapsed, thus removing it. He had escaped just in time. I guess there's not a lot of secrets left between us now. Sunny was sure that there was a new rune that Nephice could summon. One reading slave. Just like he now had access to all the information about her, she was going to learn everything about him. The unique nature of his cores, the shadow fragments, the true identity of the Marble Saint, the Weaver's mask, she was going to know it all. That could potentially complicate. Before he could finish that thought, however, the spell spoke again, its voice filling the black void with melodious whispers. The second seal is broken, awakening dormant powers. Oh, crap. I almost forgot. Sunny stared into the void with wide eyes. He was about to awaken. Chapter 354 Awakening. Just like after the first nightmare, Sunny suddenly sensed something waking up within him. Back then, it felt as though this new power came from inside his soul, as opposed to some external source. This time the feeling was very similar, only more intense, more defined. It was coming from his shadow cores. They were radiating an ethereal, but almost palpable heat. The energy was circulating through his entire body, changing it, making it stronger. It was somewhat similar to the strange feeling he got every time he received a shadow fragment, but so much more powerful. 1,000 times more powerful. And deeper, too. With a barely audible gasp, Sunny slowly sat down and crossed his legs, then closed his eyes, concentrating on the transformation. Every fiber of his being was soon full of the mysterious energy. The familiar euphoric feeling overwhelmed him, washing over his mind like a warm wave. However, Sunny wanted to feel more and understand more. He wanted to remember this moment in every detail. It was his triumph, after all. Beneath the physical changes that his body was undergoing to become better, stronger, more perfect was another, subtle, but equally incredible change. It was happening to his soul. Sunny had no words to describe it, but knew that he had never experienced anything as wonderful. The transformation of his soul was not at all painful, like the creation of the second shadow core had been, and not nearly as torturous as the agony that consuming a drop of divine blood had caused him. It felt natural, right, and profound, as though he was coming one step closer to becoming complete, to what he had always been meant to be, a better being. Soon, the pulsating waves of heat retreated, replaced by a wave of soothing coldness. The dull ache in his heart that had remained there, unnoticed, ever since leaving the forgotten shore lessened a little. His mind became calm and tranquil. Sunny felt like a sword that had been tempered and fortified in a fiery crucible, a being made of cold, pure, resilient steel. He exhaled slowly and opened his eyes. His body felt stronger, faster, and more enduring, similar to how he felt when wrapped in the shadow. The change was sufficiently pronounced, and he knew that it would only grow greater if he used one or both of the shadows to actually augment him. But it wasn't the main difference. Sunny knew that the actual quality that separated Awakened from the Dreamers was not physical might, but a new innate ability. Just like Dreamers gain the ability to sense and interact with soul cores, the Awakened could do the same with soul essence. But knowing and feeling were two different things. Before, he could vaguely feel his shadow core. The feeling was elusive and ethereal, but unmistakable. He felt its emptiness at the start of his journey, and felt it brimming with power near the end. Now, that power wasn't contained inside the shadow cores anymore, but broke free, flowing naturally through his entire body. It circulated slowly, coming and going from the cores, passively saturating his bones and muscles with power. Sunny instinctually felt that, with some practice, he would be able to direct the flow of shadow essence to concentrate it in a certain area. He could expend some amount of essence to give his arms incredible, explosive strength for a short amount of time, or feel his legs with the power to jump a dozen meters into the air. In short, it wasn't as though he had become monstrously strong and would be all the time, crashing through walls and breaking delicate things by accident. Instead, by wisely controlling his shadow essence, he would be able to gift himself short bursts of truly inhuman physical might. The rest of the time, he would enjoy a much smaller, but still considerable passive effect of his body being saturated with freely flowing essence. More training. Sunny could now control the shadow essence by instinct, but if he wanted to truly master it and do it more efficiently, he would have to learn from experienced Awakened. Some instructors at the academy existed for the sole purpose of teaching newly awakened just that, after all. And then there was a whole another layer of combat strategy that he would have to understand and master. Sleepers thought much like mundane humans, only with more power and tools. But battles of the Awakened were much more tactical. While essence always restored itself to the core's maximum capacity, it took time. In the reality of a battle, it was a finite resource. Because of it, one had to be smart and careful about how and when to use it. He would also have to absorb as many shadow fragments as possible to increase the capacity of his cores. Luckily, he now had 2 of them, which already gave him a big advantage over the rest of the Awakened. But this new amazing quality he had received was not the end of the awakening. The main event was yet to happen. The spells spoke again, filling him with anticipation. Awakening aspect ability. Aspect ability acquired. Aspect ability name, Shadow Step. Sunny blinked, then hurriedly summoned the runes. Name, Sunless. True name, Lost from Light. Rank, Awakened. Class, Monster. Shadow Cores, 2-7. Shadow Fragments, 0/2000. Just as expected, both of his cores were not dormant anymore, instead becoming awakened. The shadow fragments were consumed to fuel the awakening, bringing him to a stark and sad 0. 1,000 fragments, gone just like that. He wasn't really disappointed, though. The amount of essence consumed during the awakening directly corresponded to the starting capacity of the core, and thus, the extent of the physical transformation that a sleeper would go through. By collecting 1,000 fragments and fully saturating his first core, Sunny not only received a second one but also made sure to gain the best benefits a sleeper could dream of. Very few awakened had ever fully saturated their cores before returning from their first journey to the dream realm, and now, Sunny was one of them. The difference was not drastic, but every little bit of power counted in a life-and-death situation. Enough stalling. Impatient, he banished the thoughts of cores and shadow fragments and found the description of his new aspect ability. Aspect ability. Shadow Step. Ability description. You can move freely between shadows, traveling from one to another in an instant. Looking at the shimmering runes, Sunny soon discovered that there was a stupid grin on his face. Teleportation. That's teleportation, right? That was, without a doubt, a form of teleportation. An ability such as this was a game changer. His mobility would become truly incredible. Not only would he be able to apply it to traversal, making his future ventures into the dream realm easier and safer, but it could also play a decisive role in a battle. What was more deadly than an assassin capable of appearing out of nowhere and disappearing from sight in the blink of an eye? Not many things, really. Of course, He would have to experiment and learn the true extent of this amazing ability. What was its range, for example? Would he be able to jump to any shadow in sight, or to any shadow in the range of his shadow sense? Did a shadow have to be deep and large enough for him to fit through, or would even the smallest and faintest of them do? And what about his own shadows? Would he be able to send one to a certain spot and then step out of it, just like Saint usually did? He couldn't wait to learn. But before that, there were two other things he had to see. One was the new memory he acquired. The other one, and the one that filled him with nervous anticipation, was much more important. It was the relic he was supposed to receive for mastering the first step of the shadow dance. With a legacy relic in his hands and a lineage attribute coursing through his blood, Sunny would be theoretically eligible to create his own legacy clan. A great clan, even. Not that he was planning to. But before Sunny could glance at the corresponding runes, the spell suddenly whispered into his ear. "Wake up, sunless." And instantly, the black void full of bright stars and silver light disappeared.